Okay. So again, welcome to the MPCA conference and to the Planning Commissioner training. The state of Maryland, a few years back, 2009, I think it is, put on the books a legislative requirement that planning commissioners and Board of Appeals members within the first 6 months of your tenure as a commission member or a Board of Appeals member are to get this training. We have an online training program that's available for you. It's actually much more in depth and details. It's an area that we need to do some reworking and some advanced updating of it, but it is very good. But we also provide this in-person training 3 times a year, usually at MML, MACO, and MPCA. Every time. So in those events, we are here to hopefully answer your questions that are more specific to your community. So please feel free to let us know. There's 9 other states that actually require this. So you're not alone in this. We found it to be a very useful tool for people that are first starting out to be planning commission members. What should be a good way of doing it, what may not be a good way of doing it. Go ahead and advance, next slide. So the virtual audience, this slide shows the process. We will be monitoring the questions, and this is the old slide from the GoToWebinar, but we will monitor those, and we'll be asking those at strategic places. We'll show where they are. We'll have some breaks along the way for those that need to have the restrooms are at the back of the hall here. Needless to say, we're going to keep this thing moving because there's a lot of it in there. And at the end, I usually have my last bit, and I have 5 minutes to do 30 minutes of work. So I'm going to try to keep us on track. As I said, the Planning Commission training is required of all municipal, county, and includes all charter counties, even including Montgomery and Prince George's County. Each individual member is supposed to take the training. We actually report on those members that have taken it, so it's on our website. Next slide, Joe. The logistics here. We had a clicker, but we gave her 1 clicker to the other conference training on ethics, so we don't have that. So someone's bound by that little room over there. Okay. So like I said, we have this online training at planning.maryland.gov, and you can go to the MPCA page. We actually have an MPCA page. It's there, as well as is on there. At the end of this, we will send out certificates, and we'll send out the PowerPoint presentation. Next slide. Again, thank you for being a participant at the local level and volunteering your service to your communities. Communities, you are an invaluable member of the government, believe it or not, in terms of you providing that first line of communication to your neighbors and your various community groups, church associations, etc. So it's really valuable for you to be that liaison between your communities, your neighbors, your families, and the local government. And I want to thank you for your service. It's very important for you to have that local perspective in this Board of Appeals as well as the Planning Commission to give that perspective. Next slide. As I mentioned before, Joe is our manager of local assistance and training. He's lead staff for MPCA and is got a team of regional planners throughout the state that can support your efforts. Please look to him. If you have questions, he will connect you to the various parts of our Department of Planning at the state, as well as other state agencies. So we are your connection to that. So please feel free to contact Joe. Adam Snyder is our Maryland Department of Planning MDP's legal counsel, Assistant Attorney General, and he is our go-to person when we have any legal challenges or questions that we need to figure out. And so he's a great person for you to look at. And again, my job at the Department of Planning is Director of Coordination. I have a variety of other units that manage, and I interface with all of the locals as well as their state agencies. Next slide. Go ahead. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to follow and up with the fundamentals of planning. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. I use this. So has everybody seen the sign-in sheet coming around? Everybody signed in? All right, because that's we won't have a record of you taking the class unless you fill that out. Make sure your email's nice and legible. Because what always happens is when I send those out, there's a some where I turned an E into a C or something like that, and I have to figure it out because it get kicked back. So I hope you made it fairly legible. Okay, you can move forward, Chuck. Okay, so I think a lot of you could probably answer this question of what makes Maryland unique. It's always been a magnet for growth. We're close to DC. We have beaches, we have beautiful mountains, farmlands and forests, and historic towns. Plus it's on the eastern seaboard, so we've had a long time to develop here. It's made it a very desirable place to live, and hence planning of a key priority. You can move forward, please. Yeah, we need to get 2 clickers next year. All right. Maryland's small, right? It's the 5th densest state in the US. However, this does not mean that all of Maryland is crowded, nor does it have to be, nor is it desirable that it would be. Good planning ensures that Maryland can accommodate everyone who wants to live here, but we can still preserve our natural resources. Planning is extensive in Maryland because if we want it to remain as it is, leave it in as good state as we found it, we must consider many things about how we live. So while it is the 5th smallest state in the nation, you advance, Chuck, right? Only 18 states have more people. So that density necessitates the need to have focused planning. And these are from the 2019 census population estimates. All right, can you move forward? All right, we have a history of good planning in Maryland, and we're going to talk a lot about it today. One more. All right. Maryland planners help determine the efficient land use for homes, stores, jobs, schools, and services, and protect farms, forests, and natural resources as mentioned. And this is not just professional planners like those here and some of you. It's also, for most of you, citizen planners, commissioners, Board of Appeals members, and just residents who are engaged in planning in the community. They're just as important for good planning in Maryland. Can you move forward, Chuck? Okay, agricultural preservation is very big in Maryland. We have a new act passed last year called Maryland the Beautiful. I don't remember all the details right now, but it expands our aggressive approach to land conservation in Maryland. So priority preservation areas are designation for land that contains productive agricultural or forest soils and supports agricultural and forestry enterprises. We're going to have a session on forestry guidance tomorrow. These are governed by local policies, and they stabilize agricultural and forest land use. So the development, right, you see how dense Maryland is, and as it grows, does not convert or compromise these resources. There's also the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation under the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Has a very awkward acronym called MALPF. Say LP and F in a row, and not many words that have that. It was established in 1997 and focuses specifically on agricultural preservation easements. The Maryland Department of Planning, who we all work for, sits on the Rural Legacy Board. So Rural Legacy is yet another form of land conservation and provides funding through the Department of Natural Resources this time. So you see we have multiple agencies involved in this effort. You got MDA, Agricultural, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, to preserve large contiguous tracts of land and to enhance natural resource, agricultural, forestry, and environmental protection, while supporting a sustainable land base for natural resource-based industries, right? Because just because the land is preserved, right, doesn't mean it can't be used and contributing to the economy through agricultural, forestry, these other reasons. but still important to preserve those tracks in a natural state. Can you move forward? Maryland Department of Planning with our partners created a Maryland Protected Lands dashboard. We'd be happy to provide the link to you, but it shows all the different varieties or all the acres that have been preserved in Maryland through various means. I mentioned a few of them already. You'll see by category, and if you enjoy maps, you enjoy geography, enjoy clicking around and exploring, I definitely recommend you go check it out. Can you move forward, Chuck? Okay, so getting back to a history of good planning. Planners protect historic resources as well. The Maryland Historical Trust, which is based in Crownsville, is also a part of the Maryland Department of Planning. And then there's a lot of local historic preservation agencies as well. The Sustainable Communities Tax Credit has helped rehabilitate about 4,400 historic buildings and create 25,000 jobs since 1996. And the state's investment of about $350 million has reached into all of Maryland's 23 counties and the city of Baltimore. Can you move forward again? As I mentioned, MHT is the state's historic preservation office. The trust focuses on identification, protection, and enhancement of heritage resources from our shared past. And this complements the department's goal to plan for Maryland's future, right? So the trust is responsible for undertaking the survey and documentation of architectural and archaeological services. So it's not just the buildings, but also what's under the ground. And this is done through partnership with local government and nonprofit organizations. Let's see. In District 45, which Maryland is a part of, there are 8 districts and 26 sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places, including the American Brewery, pictured here. This is in Baltimore, which is a great success story of historic revitalization, contributing to neighborhood revitalization. This listing on the National Register allowed the brewery to access both state and federal tax credits. All right. Can you move forward for me, Chuck? Okay. The trust administers several programs aimed at protecting historic properties. They have a review and compliance program. It administers review of state and federal undertakings to ensure that Maryland's historic and archaeological properties will not be adversely affected or destroyed by for development, usually through federal or state funding. This is called a Section 106 review. Many of you are probably familiar with that, which arose out of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the Maryland Historical Trust Act of 1985. They also have a historic preservation easement program. So similar as earlier we were talking about agricultural or land conservation easements, there's also historic preservation easement programs governed by the Maryland Historic Trust. And then MHT is not only regulatory, they also assist local governments. They help local preservation offices. They also have resources and funding. And then MHT is required to update its state historic preservation plan every 5 years. They are currently in the process of updating it. I know over the summer they sent out a survey. Did anybody get that survey, complete that survey? Been involved in any? Yeah, I saw one nod back there. Great, great. I know we provided input on that survey as well. If you're interested, follow up with me afterwards. They're still seeking feedback and I can provide you some information. Okay, can you move forward? All right, back to a future of good planning. All right, so what else do planners do? Planners develop and redevelop in strategic areas to provide places for people to live and work. Can you keep going? All right, so this is Chuck's favorite slide, I think. So which location is this? Correct, that's Frederick. But it is a beautiful picture. And somebody who wasn't from Maryland might be fooled, I think. But I think a lot of us have been to Frederick. And we were actually there last year as part of the Planning Commissioner, or the Maryland Planning Commissioner MPCA conference. All right. We're going to get into a little bit of history here for a while. So planning does go way back. We're not going to go all the way back. But in 1916, New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning regulations applying citywide. And these zoning regulations regulated things that are still regulated today, such as height, bulk, and the use of the land. The Standard Zoning Enabling Act was created in 1922 under then U.S. Department of Commerce head Secretary Herbert Hoover. And then the model law drafted by the U.S. Drafted by Commerce It provided guidance and enabling law, and he could explain it better than me, that states could use to enable jurisdictions to apply zoning in their own zoning ordinances. Down on the right, you'll see Daniel Burnham, who is fairly famous in the world of planning. If you take any tests or study any courses on history of planning, Daniel Burnham is often the answer to the question. He took a leading role in the creation of master plans for many, many cities in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and his famous phrase was, "Make no small plans." This is from the Columbia Exhibition in 1893. And that gives you a good sense of what planning, that original form, at least of American planning, was like. Very grand, very big, focus on, the showstopper avenues, boulevards, big architectural pieces. Another famous planner would be Edmund Bacon here on the left, and he focused on redevelopment in Philadelphia in his long stint as the planning director there. Chuck. Okay, so as mentioned, the plans for big industrial cities at the turn of the 20th century recommended extensive development, redevelopment, and huge infrastructure projects. At the time, right, this was the growth of these cities. The industry was booming, so were the populations booming. So they were trying to accommodate these populations. And this resulted in many iconic achievements and many return on investments. Many of the things you would consider emblematic of our major cities would have been developed at this time. But I think all of us are familiar with the idea of post-industrial landscapes and how things have changed since then. So in the mid 20th century, in the name of urban renewal, some big plans resulted in the widespread destruction of existing neighborhoods for urban highways, large housing projects. And that created, it was an attempt back then to address the problems at the time, but unintended consequences, we all learn from our mistakes. Those created some problems that we're still dealing with today. All right. Can you move forward, Chuck? All right. So the Chicago Plan Commission was created in 1909 to implement the Plan of Chicago. This is often called the Burnham Plan, hence the Daniel Burnham, he always pops up. It was successful at fostering relationships with the politicians and encouraging voters to support the initiatives. And in the end, Chicagoans approved 86 plan-related bond issues covering some 17 different projects. Move forward. I think there might be a couple clicks here. All right, so there's just some quotes. I'm not going to read them to you, but you should have them on yours. We'll also send the slides afterwards, so a PDF version so you can look at it. Okay, but as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't all uncheckered progress, right? Following World War II, planners and civic leaders throughout the country initiated a concept commonly known as urban renewal. Often the purpose here was to clear and to redevelop what they called slums in the name of civic and economic progress. And this was often done with the support of federal funding. If you think about, this is modernism of the late 40s and 50s. If we apply scientific techniques and planning, we can solve all of our problems. But this was often done in working class and predominantly minority communities, right? Oftentimes these were culturally rich and vibrant, but from whoever is making decisions at the top, they would consider them slums or something that we needed to get rid of. Little concern was given to the opinion of the existing residents, right? So the decision makers at the top were deciding what we needed to do with these communities. And this was Burnham's make no small plans taken to a frightening extreme, right? So it was working. It created a lot of what we consider iconic infrastructure, cityscapes back at in the industrial boom. But when you go, you take this to where its ultimate extent, you're going to be destroying communities at the same time. So one person who pushed back is Jane Jacobs. She's very famous, never a professional trained planner. But this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is a must read for anybody who's studying planning at school. You basically have to read it. So she rose to prominence when Robert Moses, who was a very, very powerful New York City official at the time, before and after post-World War II, he wanted to extend Fifth Avenue directly through Washington Square Park, near where she lived. And she organized community-based resistance and ultimately succeeded, and he scrapped his plans. So she took a different approach to planning than what had come before. So in Death and Life of Great American Cities, she talks about how complicated cities are, that they should be filled with people and that density was good. Oftentimes, prior to that, you're envisioning, the suburban life, that cities should look more like suburbs, and they wanted to get rid of the density, right? And that people and activity on streets provided not only liveness and a vitality, but what she called eyes on the street. The more people on the street, the more density, more vibrancy, it creates safety because people are viewing the street, or natural surveillance. And she argued planning ought to be about people, not the buildings, right? So whereas before, that might not have been the focus, she kind of gave it that focus. Can you move forward? So why plan, all right? That's a little bit of the history. We'll come back to some more history in a second. Ultimately, it's so that we can guide sustainable and efficient use of our land, right? Land use planning, often consider like one of the cores of planning. It also helps us figure out how much public infrastructure, this could be water and sewer, roads and schools, community facilities, we need to support our population and that growth. It also helps us protect sensitive resources, could be wetlands, could be, all those, the land we were talking about earlier, land conservation, agricultural areas. And planning is very interdisciplinary, right? Planners don't just go in and look at only land use and zoning. You have to consider everything. And as a planning commissioner or board of zoning appeals member, you have to do the same. When I tell people I'm a planner, I don't think my mom really knows what I do still. But when I tell people I'm a planner, the first thing they ask me is if I can fix the potholes on the road. And I really, that's not I can talk to somebody about it, but that's not what I do, right? It's really hard. It's so interdisciplinary and broad, and it's hard to explain. And you probably have the same thing if you're trying to explain to friends and family what you do on the planning commission. I wouldn't be surprised if they have difficulty understanding it well as well. So planning requires foresight and a long-term planning horizon, right? We have really long, extensive plans, right? I'm seeing these comprehensive plans come in, they're all 2040, 2050. We have to look forward a long way. Can you move forward? Okay, so what's the role of planning? Understanding the physical landscape and a diverse and dynamic population, right? There's the people and the places. You need to gauge the appropriateness of developments and the capacity to fit them into the whole that is greater than just the sum of the parts. And you need to combine and synthesize different ideas, right? You're never going to have everybody agree on a plan. You're never going to be able to fully find true consensus. But as planners, both citizen or professional, you really need to look at all the different opinions, all the different approaches, and do your best. You're always going to make some people upset in the end, but you really need to combine and synthesize these different ideas to provide that long-term vision. Can you move forward? Okay, so as mentioned earlier, and we'll look here a little bit more focusedly, planning has always been a force for good, or positive force in America. Going back even farther than urban renewal and with the support of New Deal policies, planning and planners also contributed to racial segregation and social injustice in America. In the 30s, the Federal Home Owners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created residential security or red line maps of major American cities. This is Baltimore, one of the first ones, and one of the ones that's often used to demonstrate this concept. Those areas shown in red are predominantly African-American neighborhoods and were labeled hazardous. And therefore, mortgage lenders and appraisers denied services, loans, and capital investment within that red line. And then the New Deal's FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, denied minority households access to the federally backed guaranteed mortgage loans created through the National Housing Act of 1934. All right, so you see a housing boom and this increase in family wealth through a lot of these New Deal policies, but they specifically did not go to minority households in this country. If you compare this map from 1937 to a map of poor economic and health indicators in Baltimore today, you'll be amazed at how much they align. All right, so there is that through line there. Essentially, the refusal of the federal government to provide the same housing finance to benefits to families of color with the support of local leaders significantly contributed to today's wealth gap. But there are other examples as well, even at the local level, right? This is federal and local, but restrictive covenants preventing Black families from purchasing homes within certain neighborhoods, strengthened de facto segregation, And exclusionary zoning, I'm not sure if we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that term, but exclusionary zoning really, it limits the supply and access of affordable housing through creating really large minimum lot size requirements and single residence per lot requirements, making homes in many communities out of reach to lower income individuals. Because, you increase the lot size, increase the house size, it raises the price. And then finally, budgets demonstrate priorities, and far too often, American jurisdictions have prioritized capital investment, schools, infrastructure, parks, things like that, in wealthier neighborhoods at the expense of the rest. All right, but they're active. This is nothing new. Maybe some of the term planning for equity is a little bit newer, but this has been going on for a while. There are efforts and ways to combat that. Even if current staff and officials do not contribute to history, they serve in positions representing that history, all right? And sometimes need to go out of our way to overcome this legacy. We need to be deliberate in our approach as those who are planning for inequity were in the past. This may lead to discomfort, but it is a vital part of the process, and it requires listening over explaining. It goes back to, this connects back to what Jane Jacobs was focused on, the people, not just the places. Planning for equity requires that everyone, those particularly in underserved communities, participate authentically in the planning process. Examples here are planning academies. These have been implemented in Baltimore City, Howard County. I know Prince George's is one, where they're kind of doing what we're doing here right now, but for the residents in a community, right? Planning, as I was saying earlier, a lot of people don't know what it is. It's hard to explain. It's hard to engage a community, particularly underserved communities, if they don't know what planning is either, right? So you don't put all these complicated documents out there and then don't explain them and expect people to actually engage authentically. So these planning academies go into communities and they really help educate their community. Planning organizations also need to look internally when planning for equity. Do we look like and represent the stakeholders we are supposed to serve, right? I mean, I'll put that on us. Look, we have 3 white men up here teaching this class, right? We need to do a better job at the Maryland Department of Planning. All right, and I think a lot of planning organizations need to do the same. All right, so I think we all need to be honest with each other in that respect. All right, okay. Yeah. One thing can you go back? One thing I want to look at the Sherry Arnstein ladder of the last thing I'll say is Arnstein's ladder of public participation. Also something you'll definitely learn in planning school, that we all understand the importance of engagements, going out to the community, but there's different levels of it and authentic nature. You go from manipulation, where you're making it seem like people are engaged, but you're really just telling them what's going on, all the way up to citizen control, right? Citizen control is not necessarily, I'm not saying that's necessarily the best for everything. There's different things, there's different gradations in there in between. But when you're examining your public outreach processes through a comprehensive plan or anything else, you really need to consider how much are we really listening? How much authority are we sharing? All right, that's very important. All right, go ahead, sorry. Am I going too slowly? Okay, I always am. Any questions before we move on? Yes, sir. Actually, I'm sorry. We have a virtual audience, and I need to remember this. Whenever you all are speaking, if you can mind speaking to the microphone so the people in the virtual audience can hear you.
My name is Lynn Harrison, President of Santan Winchester Community Association. And we've been having issues with DOT, with traffic calming, with series of accidents for over 30 years that involve seniors, children, and so forth. And we've been trying to get them to give us traffic calming. Now they could put bicycle routes in the city and all these other things in more affluent traffic calming in more affluent areas, but we're one of those poor areas that you have on that map.
Yeah.
And we feel as though, and also presenting this to the attorney over there. We feel as though that our human rights are being violated by the DOT, Department of Transportation.
Yeah.
And we need something done about it. And I'd like to know how legally we could approach that, because they've been ignoring all our demands for street calming after not just but we presented them with evidence of how economically it affects the community, you know, medically, and also people don't have adequate transportation to get to jobs and to and fro, and senior citizens as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I can have a legal answer, but I would say I also live in, no. I live in Baltimore City, and I know as well, I live in a different neighborhood, but I know how we really went through our council person. And that's how we got some, at least speed bumps. I wouldn't call it full scale traffic calming in our neighborhood. Huh? You done that? Okay. Nothing yet. Well, it's, you know, keep the pressure on, and I don't know what we can say about the legal aspect of it, but I know DOT, they usually want traffic studies, is my understanding. Have you, I know you said you did that. Did they give you a reason? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not gonna be able to give you an answer right now, and I know that's not what you're asking, but no, that's an example of what we've been talking about. Yeah, Chuck. Yeah, you'll follow up you. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Did you have a question? Oh, all right. I'm going to keep moving. We'll have other time for it's a very good point, and it illustrates exactly what we were talking about here. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. So as I was talking earlier about the Zoning Enabling Act, right? The state of Maryland actually has the authority for planning and zoning. However, it delegates that authority to counties and municipalities that have their own planning and zoning authority. It does this through that enabling legislation, right? Similar to what I was talking about before. It enables charter counties to enact local planning and zoning laws, and it enables non-charter counties, as well as Montgomery and Prince George's counties, in specific areas such as required, and they have different optional elements for the comprehensive plans. Other planning state-related legislation includes things like water and sewer planning, smart growth policies, stormwater management, a lot of the stuff that Chuck is going to talk about later. Next one. Okay. The land use article was enacted into law during the 2012 General Assembly session. Those who've been working this for a while might remember 66B. It's now the land use article. It has lots of specific provisions. You'll find things specific to certain counties and stuff, and one size doesn't fit all. And there are two main divisions. Division 1 is for authority and planning requirements, land use in commission counties, municipal corporations in Baltimore City, and then Prince George's and Montgomery County have their own specific division called Division 2. Don't need to remember all that. Just know if you were to go in there and you're looking for Montgomery County or Prince George's stuff, you're going to find them in a different location. All right, next one. Here's a map of charter and non-charter counties. They're all governed by this new, or the land use article. The green counties are charter or code counties. They have different comp plan requirements, and they have a council form of government. The blue counties are non-charter counties, and they have a commissioner form of government. And when it comes to the land use article, there's a lot of overlap between municipalities and non-charter counties, especially when it comes to comprehensive plans. But not 100% overlap. Okay, next one. Okay, so here's some planning milestones, going all the way back to Penn's plan for Philadelphia. You know, planning's been going on in this country for a long time. And they've led to some great places like Central Park here. We're going to talk about law a little bit more, or Adam's going to talk a lot more about it, particularly Euclid versus Ambler Realty, but that is a very important case right there from 1926. Can you move forward? All right, so Maryland, milestones, we had formed our first state planning commission back in 1933. Let me see, are my notes here correct? Yeah, anyway. Maryland State Department of Planning, 1959, all the way up to some of the ones you might be more familiar with now, such as the Priority Funding Areas Act, well, it had a longer name, but that's from 1997, and then the Sustainable Communities Act, which provides funding and other resources inside certain areas of PFAs for revitalization. Next one. Okay, so priority funding areas, Chuck's gonna go into this a lot more, but the idea here is to focus growth. We're talking about, you know, Maryland is dense but small, but we can still preserve our certain areas we want to preserve, or resources. One of the ways to do that is through or the state influences that is through priority funding areas to focus growth-related funding within them and preserve the land outside them. Go for it. Yeah. All right, there's certain requirements to be a priority funding area. They are designated locally, and then the Maryland Department of Planning concurs with them, certifies them. It needs to have existing or planned water and sewer service, an average residential density of 3.5 dwelling units per acre. Right, so we want to achieve that certain density. Remember, we were talking about Jane Jacobs talking about how density is good. It needs to have a growth plan consistent with projections, and the size of the PFA is based on land needed for 20 years. So you don't just expand your PFA out to where forever, right? It's supposed to be a measured growth over 20 years. Go ahead, Chuck. All right, so here's a chart that shows that between 1998 and 2018 developed parcels. You see here it's hard to see the color, but inside the PFA is the orangish. So you see these parcels developed, 71.9% developed inside the PFA. But if you look at acres developed, 74.9% outside the PFA. And if you think about it, that makes sense because inside the PFA is supposed to be denser, so you have smaller parcels. All right. So when you have a lot more developed, even though the actual acreage developed is bigger outside of the PFA, because those are larger parcels, right? So you want that density inside, you want larger. You don't want it outside. Okay. So the trends in Maryland, we have 600,000 new jobs by 2040. My colleague, Jason Dubois, who is going to do a presentation tomorrow on forestry guidance, always talks about, I can't remember what year, but he says Maryland's going to add a population the size of Seattle. I think he says it once. He reminds us all the time. I can't remember what year, 2050? Okay. So movement of jobs outside of urban communities contributes to the decline of established cities and towns. All right, so when you want that density, you want people living in urban areas because it increases that vibrancy and the jobs there. All right, here's some more statistics. I'm not going to read them all, but it gives you a sense of. Let me see. Hold on. Maybe I'll read some of them. So yeah, 650. We'll go for it. I'll send that to you. You can look at it later. All right. So we have some questions here, and then I will be stopping. We'll turn it over to Adam. So Maryland is the 5th most densely populated state. True or false? It is true. Correct. I just went over this one, and I kind of zoomed over it, so I wouldn't blame you if you didn't get it right. Maryland is expected to grow by how many new jobs by 2040? 600,000. If I remember, hopefully I remember correctly. All right. What? Yeah. So I used to be a teacher, and you got to be very careful with all the aboves because they're almost all. If you have just all the aboves in a question, it gives away to the student that that's probably the answer. So if you want to use all of the above, you do it for every single question. And anyway, anytime you see all of the above in here, it's the answer. So why do we plan? Guide land use, provide infrastructure, natural protect resources, and foster economic development. Go ahead. Where do Maryland jurisdictions get their planning authority? The land use article. Remember? So the state delegates it down to them through the land use article. All right, priority funding areas. This one's a little bit tricky, but they're inside growth areas. They're not drawn by the state. They're drawn locally. The state concurs with them. They don't only include municipalities, so it's A. They do make the most efficient use of taxpayer dollars, right? We don't want to be paying for roads and sewer extensions out to areas way out in the country that are not going to be serving a lot of people. That's a waste of taxpayer dollars. All right. Any questions before I wrap up? That's the end of my section, right? Before Adam? Any questions? Yes. Oh, hold on. Make sure.
Okay, we're gonna have this transit system to bring people in from DC and Baltimore back and forth. I know it's expensive to live in DC, so
Yes.
are you looking at getting people from DC to live here because you open up that pathway of back and forth from DC to Baltimore?
Thank you. I think that is, I can't say that like the Maryland Department of Planning has like a whole work program dedicated to that. But yes, I know this, the city would like to see that. I think, one of the, Baltimore used to be 1 million people, right? And now it's just over 500,000, right? So, as Chuck always says, the smartest growth the state, some of the smartest growth the state can have is a lot of people moving to Baltimore City. So, but that's obviously not the only thing, but yes, that kind of having people that can work in DC and live in Baltimore. I mean, there's a lot of that already, but with improved transit, improved housing. I mean, there's a lot of things that, Baltimore still needs to work on and the state needs to work on to appeal that, to have people appeal to make that commute. But yes, that is a strategy. That is something that we focus. Oh, the question was trying to attract people who work in DC but to live in Baltimore because it is so expensive to live in DC. And so, yes, that is definitely a strategy, an opportunity, I'd say, more than anything. Okay, any other questions here before we go into legal? You'll have lots of questions for Adam because you might not think that the legal component's the most interesting, but people always get really engaged with it. Thank you all.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'll always hate being billed as the most engaging speaker because I'm sure to disappoint. So we're talking about the legal principles that underlie planning zone. Is this too loud? Is yours still on? Is that on? How about now? Okay. Got a lot of ground to cover here. We're going to talk about the legal authority for planning and zoning. Then we're going to talk about some of the constitutional guardrails, the landmines that might be out there as you're exercising your planning and zoning powers. Then we're going to talk about planning zoning in Maryland, things about comprehensive plans, comprehensive zoning, variants of boards of appeal, and then we're going to finish up talking about ethics. So we're covering a lot of ground here. And I am going to move this microphone down a little. How about that? Maybe that's better. Okay, slide. All that Joe talked about has its origins in this case from 1926, Euclid versus Ambler Realty. Now, Euclid is a town outside of Cleveland that enacted a zoning ordinance that identified areas within their jurisdiction that would be developed for.
Here, try this.
As zoning ordinances are, and identify different areas for industrial, residential, and commercial use. A company owned a number of different parcels throughout the town, and some of which they wanted to develop for industrial or commercial uses, but they were within residential districts. And as a result, that restricted how they could use their property. So they challenged the ordinance as a unconstitutional imposition on their private property rights, and the trial court agreed. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that that type of broad brush zoning, kind of categorizing areas for different types of uses, is a permissible use of local police powers, that local governments are free to shape their communities in the way they want to try to best provide for public health, safety, and welfare. Now, slide. The court was clear, though, that it was not talking about the application of zoning to specific properties. It was, again, the landowners at the time were just challenging the zoning ordinance. They weren't challenging the denial of a building permit. And the court said that when it comes to that, when zoning is applied to an individual piece of property, they're not touching that in the Euclid case. So Euclid upholds broad planning and zoning, but the constitutional provision that governs the application of zoning to a particular property is, slide. No, go back. The Fifth Amendment of the US Constitution, particularly the Takings Clause, that provides nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now, that's just 12 words in the Constitution. 7 of those words have generated thousands of federal and state appellate decisions because they're heavily litigated. Now, we're not going to be talking here about public use or what constitutes private property or what constitutes just compensation, although we could have courses that covered all those things in great detail. Instead, we're going to focus on what constitutes a taking, because that's something that you ought to be aware of as you go about discharging your duties as a planning commissioner. So can you slide, please? 3 types of takings that I'm going to talk about: eminent domain, regulatory takings, and certain types of exactions. Slide. Eminent domain, you're familiar with. This is when the government comes, knocks on your door and says, hey, we're putting in a road or we're putting in a park and we need to run it through your backyard. So we're going to take your backyard, we're going to pay you money for it, and they can do that. The government can do that. There's no issues with that at all. And that's probably not something that you're going to have to deal with very much in your roles. That's usually something that the Department of Public Works or the people who are building roads or public buildings might have to deal with. Like the inter-county connector, when that was put in, lots of properties had to be taken in connection with that. Slide. Where the action is for planning and zoning is in regulatory taking, and when we get to it, exactions. Now, the regulatory taking is, as its name suggests, a taking that occurs as a result of governmental regulation. And the trick here is that all governmental regulation affects property values in some way. So, you know, when EPA imposes stricter air quality control requirements, coal becomes less valuable because it's a more polluting source of fuel. And when the government outlaws the sale of endangered species, your cache of endangered eagle feathers becomes less valuable because you can't sell it anymore. So, but in many other small ways, government regulation is constantly affecting the value of property, plus and minus. And you have to find out a way to distinguish between that kind of normal and acceptable variation and effects on property values that go too far. And the Supreme Court has identified 3 different tests for determining what is going too far. The first, slide, is the Penn Central test. Now, it's not much of a test. It's really just an ad hoc balancing analysis that looks at three factors: the economic effect of the governmental action, the reasonable investment-backed expectations, and the character of the government action. And the case arose from Grand Central Station in Manhattan. The owners of Grand Central Station wanted to build a high-rise office building on top of Grand Central Station, but there was a Historic Preservation Commission in New York City which denied them authorization to do that because Grand Central Station is a historic landmark. So the owners sued, saying, hey, you've deprived me of a very valuable right in the airspace above my building. And the court developed this approach to determining whether that type of regulation goes too far. And the court held, applying these factors, said, well, economic effect of the governmental action. You still have use of your property as a train station, and by virtue of the imposition of this restriction on your building rights, you got transferable development rights that you could sell to other property owners in the area. So it's not like you've been completely lost all economic value. Reasonable investment-backed expectations. Well, when you bought this property, you bought it as a train station and for a train station. So telling you can't do anything more on top of it doesn't really frustrate those expectations. The character of the government action, the court said, this is not as if the government is saying, we want to build our own building above your train station. The government is just saying, you need to leave it alone so we can preserve the historic building that is there. So this is the test that applies to almost all takings. Now, the problem with this test is, like any other ad hoc multi-factor test, it's very non-predictive. It's very difficult to tell what is going to be a taking when you're just looking at all these different factors and weighing them and balancing them. So the court, in an effort to try to, the Supreme Court, in an effort to try to provide some bright line tests, identified two categories of situations that will always be a taking. Slide. The first, and it's underneath the little black bar at the top, but is physical takings. Now this is a taking occurs when the government authorizes a permanent physical occupation of private property. And this was based on the Loretto teleprompter case, which involved a New York City, again, New York City, ordinance that required the owners of apartment buildings to allow cable companies to install a cable box on the side of the building and associated wiring so that those could be interconnected throughout the city and they could provide cable service to all residents of Manhattan who wanted to subscribe for it. A owner of an apartment building sued, saying, well, you're requiring me to allow someone to put something on my property. And the court held that that was a taking. Now, it has like zero effect on the value of the property. It's a tiny, it's like 3 square feet max, very small imposition, but it is a permanent occupation of private property. And the government and the court said that constitutes a taking. The second slide, the second category of automatic takings is the Lucas style total take. You'll hear this referred to in a variety of ways, but usually Lucas is involved. Now, this stemmed from a South Carolina Beach Management Act that essentially drew a line in the sand parallel to the water and said, you can't develop waterward of this line. They were trying to protect the dunes that are in that area and that those dunes protect the buildings behind it. Mr. Lucas owned 2 lots that were waterward of that line, so he could not develop. Now, he had 2 lots, but on all sides of his lots, there were already houses. So he was being deprived of a right to build when people previously had been building in that same spot. He brought a takings claim, went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, that's the taking because he has no economically viable use of his property. All he could do was put, a sunbrella, he could sunbathe, he could maybe camp, but that's it. But that's not what our Constitution requires. You have to be able to make some economically viable use of your property. And when you deprive someone of that ability, that constitutes a taking. Slide. Now, the problem here, everyone, all takings litigants, plaintiffs, try to get into the Lucas box. They try to say that this is a total take. But the court has been very clear that it has to be a complete deprivation of economically viable use and a complete deprivation of value. That just a mere diminution of value of like even 70%, 85, 90% is not enough. Even in the Lucas case itself, where they're announcing this rule, the Supreme Court said that a deprivation or a diminution of value of up to 95% is probably not enough. It has to be a total take. Now, what that does is it prompts landowners who think they're being, mistreated by various restrictions to kind of argue creatively about the impact of a particular restriction on their property. So, for example, let's say you have a 100-acre parcel and 20 acres of it are wetlands. The landowner will sue and say, hey, you took 100% of that 20-acre square of wetlands that's on my property, so I should get compensation under Lucas. And the Supreme Court says, no, you have to look at the parcel as a whole. So in that example, you'd look at the value of the whole 100-acre parcel, and there the deprivation of value is, it's going to be like 20%. And it may be that the lots around, the area around that wetland might be a little more valuable because now there's this undeveloped wild land that they get to look out over. So that's another place we see a lot of activity in the takings context, is trying to manipulate the parcel as a whole principle. And there's a lot of Supreme Court cases on that issue as well. Next slide. Now let's talk about exactions, which is the third category of ways that planning and zoning restrictions can constitute a taking. And an exaction is an affirmative condition placed on receipt of a permit or a special exception or other action or approval that is specific to an individual property, and and it can constitute a taking unless it needs to have a rational nexus and a rough proportionality. And I'm going to unpack what that means, again, by reference to the Supreme Court cases that created this principle. Slide. The first is Nolan versus California Coastal Commission. This involved, as you might be able to tell from the graphic here, the Nolans owned a small house, beachfront house, that had a public road in front, and they wanted to replace it with a much larger house. And the California Coastal Commission said, well, okay, but we're afraid that that's going to reduce the public's vision of the water as they go down that public street, and they will lose sight of the fact that the ocean's right over there, and you might want to go visit. So we're going to require you, as a condition of our approval, that you give the public a right of way across your private beach. Now, when you're thinking about this, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, what's the connection between the public's being able to see the water from the public road and being able to walk across their private beach? And the Supreme Court said, that's unconstitutional. That is a taking because there's no rational connection between the imposition of that condition and the problem that permitting this activity would create. So the Supreme Court was, okay, it's a fine public purpose to want the public to see the water and be aware of that it's there. But this restriction that you're imposing on the Nolans has nothing to do with that. You might have been able to require them to provide a public easement to a lookout area where people could go and see the beach and see the water. Maybe that would have worked, but this access along the beach has no connection. Slide. Actually, second slide. So Nolan's about there needs to be a rational nexus between the restriction and the problem you're trying to get at. Dolan versus City of Tigard, and it's, you'll hear this principle called the Dolan principle, which is, convenient. It's not the, Krzyzewski-Moliterno principle or something. This is pretty easy to remember. Under Dolan, the court held there has to be rough proportionality in nature and degree between the impacts of the proposed development and the exactions imposed. So again, Nolan is about a rational, logical connection. Dolan is about a quantity connection. The magnitude of the exaction has to be justified by the magnitude of the impacts. And the Dolan case involved someone who was wanting to increase their business. It was a hardware store, I think. And they needed to have a larger parking lot, and it was going to affect stormwater. So the permit was issued, but it came on two conditions. One was that they had to implement certain on-site stormwater improvements. And the second condition is they had to convert another piece of property that they owned elsewhere into a public greenway to allow for that area to absorb stormwater under high flow conditions. It really had nothing to do with the property, except it was all about improving stormwater. So there was some nexus there, but the court concluded that the on-site stormwater measures that were imposed were sufficient, and that requiring the off-site greenway was just going way too far. In that circumstance, it starts to feel like an exaction, or a word that you actually hear in these decisions is extortion. And that's what these cases are trying to get at. It's okay for the government to require a developer to internalize the costs of their development. If it's going to result in increased traffic, increased stormwater, what have you. You can impose conditions that require them to address that, but you can't use the approval process as a way to force the applicant to give you things that are unrelated to those impacts. And that's what this area of law is trying to get at. Slide. As I said in the beginning, when talking about exactions, they are about specific properties. Exactions is not something that is an actionable claim when we're talking about enacting a zoning code. You have to wait for how it is applied to an individual property. Next slide. Okay, so that was the Fifth Amendment takings clause. That's where all the property rights fights are waged. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about equal protection and the 14th Amendment. Nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Again, thousands of Supreme Court cases on that, including some really famous ones. The Brown v. Board of Education case that desegregated public schools is based on the 14th Amendment and those words. Now, generally speaking, the 14th Amendment requires that similarly situated people be treated similarly. Slide. Now, that doesn't mean that the government has to treat, all people, businesses, or landowners the same. You can require doctors to have meet more stringent educational requirements than, say, landscape architects, because there's more at stake. People's lives are at stake, and that's a rational distinction when setting professional qualification, for example. The question is, what are you distinguishing based on? If you're discriminating or distinguishing on the basis of a protected class, something like race, national origin, or religious affiliation, then you have to meet a very, very stringent test called strict scrutiny that requires the government to show that they have a compelling governmental interest to achieve by this discrimination, and you can't achieve it in any other way. Effectively, if you are in that box as the government and strict scrutiny applies, you lose. I mean, it's incredibly rare that a governmental restriction that is evaluated under strict scrutiny passes or is upheld. But if you're not doing that, my example about doctors and landscape architects, you're not discriminating on the basis of a protected class there, then the test is not strict scrutiny, it is rational basis, which is a very easy test to meet, and the government almost always wins if rational basis applies. Now, slide. How does this play out in the zoning context? Because in zoning, you're always distinguishing between properties. Some properties are in the residential zones, some are in the commercial zone. But because you're not distinguishing on the basis of a protected class, that rational basis applies. And that's why the Supreme Court back in 1926 didn't really have much trouble concluding that the zoning ordinance was not unconstitutional, because that's a rational basis for distinguishing between different properties. Next slide. Okay, let's take a moment for questions before we move on.
Just hopefully you can hear me and you can repeat it. Sean, in the virtual world asks, and this is getting back to the takings questions you had, can a landowner in that situation split their lot to isolate the wetlands and pursue per se in that respect?
Did everyone hear that? Okay. Almost certainly not, because that type of creative analysis, I kind of referred to that as what I was referring to. You buy a property of the 100-acre parcel, and then you subdivide it in order to try to isolate the taking onto one piece of property. That type of activity never works. The court will look at the parcel that you bought. Now, if they were two lots at the time that you bought them, one an 80-acre lot, one a 20-acre lot, you might win that at the time. And there was a Supreme Court case about 5 or 6 years ago that was kind of in the middle, where you had two lots that by operation of state law got merged into one when they were both sold into common ownership. And then the owners tried to separate them back out. And the court said, nope, parcel as a whole for that purposes is the two lots together, because they merged when they moved into private ownership. A lot of this hinges on the details of state property law and how local zoning and subdivision rules work. My guess is that under current subdivision law, it would be very difficult to take a 100-acre parcel and isolate the 20 acres of wetlands and have that subdivided out as a separate lot. I think the local land use officials who are looking at subdivision applications are on the lookout for that sort of thing. Any other questions in the front?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. In the county that I represent, there is a regulation that was adopted in the 1980s that applies to agriculturally zoned land that says basically, and I'm simplifying, that if you own an agriculturally zoned piece of property that's less than 100 acres, you may not subdivide that property by more than carving out 10% of the total. That only applies to those agriculturally zoned properties that are under 100 acres. A lot of questions have been raised in the county by people who would like to see that eliminated. And I guess my question is, does that regulation, which was rumored to be put in place to keep out small farmers in the area, and to keep out small farms, could that be interpreted to constitute a taking or other violation of equal protection?
Well, I think you've identified the two legal issues here, and I can't give you legal advice, but we can walk through the analysis. From an equal protection standpoint, you're distinguishing between farm agricultural land of less than 100 acres and greater than 100 acres. So that's not a suspect class. That is you'd apply the rational basis test to that. So the question would be, well, is there a rational basis for distinguishing between plus and minus 100-acre farms? Again, a very deferential test. And whenever the government is regulating and distinguishing between different properties, it always has to draw a line someplace. So that's going to be a difficult case to win on an equal protection analysis, because my guess is that the government would be able to come up with some rational explanation about why 100 acres is an appropriate area to draw that line. As from a taking standpoint, just looking at the numbers on the page, if they're allowed to develop 10% of their land, that's probably not going to be a Lucas total take, because, you're going to get more value from those 10 acres that you're going to develop, and you still have the rest of the property as an ongoing farm, and that's what you bought it for. So I think it would be close if it were you could only develop 1 acre or 2 acres. You might have a Lucas style Lucas situation, but probably not, because if you could develop that 1 or 2 acres, you'd look at what is the value of that, and then you compare that to the value of the farm to begin with. And if those lots that you could sell are fairly valuable, more valuable than just the percentage of the property as a whole, then you might have a reduction in value of only 20% or something like that. Or actually, you wouldn't even have a reduction in value. I mean, let me back up. You'd compare the before and after to the value of the property completely developable versus the value of the property if it's only those 2 lots. I'm not sure I'm answering your question on the takings. Do I? Yeah. Right. Right. Completely. Right. Unrestricted, yeah. I mean, unless, right. You have a 110-acre farm next to a 100-acre farm. The 110-acre farm can subdivide far more liberally than the 100-acre farm. Does the 100-acre farm have any actionable claim to equalize their development rights? And the equal protection claim would probably be the best way to do it. although I think it wouldn't win if the government had a rational basis for distinguishing between those two. As from a taking standpoint, first of all, that only gets you money. It doesn't get you equal right to subdivide. But that aside, you'd be looking at, well, what is the value of the property if I was allowed to develop it like a 110-acre farm versus the value that I'm allowed to develop it under the current rules? You compare the two, my guess is that wouldn't be close to a total take. So you'd be in the overall Penn Central, looking at these different factors. And I think the property owner would lose in that instance because they're being allowed to develop it somewhat. This feels more like an equal protection type case. But again, because you're in the rational basis world, very easy for the government to pass that. I'm moving forward. Okay, next slide. And again, okay, we're talking about planning and zoning now. We're moving out of the constitutional context and talking about Maryland law. As Joe said, the state has delegated planning and zoning authority to counties and municipalities. As to counties, how and in which statutes the state delegates planning and zoning depends on what form of governance your jurisdiction is adopted. As you can see from the slide, charter counties and code counties, you find those authorities in local government article, non-charter counties in Division 1 of the land use article, and Prince George's and Montgomery County in Division 2 of land use article. Those are not hard and fast divisions. You can find provisions in one area that apply to jurisdictions that are typically governed in another area, but roughly speaking, that's where you find the authorities applicable to these different types of jurisdictions. So, slide, it's critical to know what type of governance your county has adopted. Now there's 3 columns there. The first 2 really fall into one group. Those are the home rule counties. And home rule counties adopt home rule in one of 2 ways, either by adopting a charter, it's like a constitution, that's the charter home rule jurisdictions, or they can use a constitutional workaround that was developed in the 1960s to allow counties to get home rule powers without having to go through the difficulty of establishing a charter. That's code home rule, the middle column. Counties that have not adopted home rule in the 3rd column are referred to as commissioner counties or commission counties. And that harkens back to a time before home rule where all counties were governed by commissions. Now, the difference between home rule and non-home rule is that home rule gives the jurisdiction broader authority to legislate within its own bounds. And the flip side of that is the General Assembly is somewhat more restricted in what it can enact with respect to that jurisdiction. When you move over to the commissioner counties, that switches. The commission counties have much fewer local powers, and the General Assembly has much greater powers to legislate for that county. Slide. Now let's talk about municipalities. There are 157 incorporated municipalities in Maryland, sprinkled throughout the state, except for Howard in Baltimore County. Otherwise, they're every other jurisdiction. All incorporated municipalities have charters, and they all have municipal home rule. So in that respect, their powers to legislate within their jurisdiction are kind of similar to the home rule counties, the charter counties and the code home rule counties. Slide. Like charter and code counties, municipalities have the power to legislate on matters of local concern, and the General Assembly concomitantly has fewer powers to enact local laws within a municipality. And with respect to planning and zoning, the statutes setting out municipal power can be seen in these provisions of the local government article and in the land use article, Division 1. There are some special other municipal planning and zoning authority that applies Well, your municipality's power only applies within its jurisdiction, and any land that it is annexed, it can't apply its powers beyond its jurisdiction. And when you are a municipality that is within the jurisdiction of the WSSC or the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, there are restrictions on what you can do because those two entities have land use powers as well. Slide. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the planning and zoning process. And the first big picture step is comprehensive planning. Now, comprehensive planning is almost an aspirational document. It's the jurisdiction charting out what their vision of what their jurisdiction is going to look like over the next 10 years or so. Now, the comprehensive plan, everything that comes after the comprehensive plan, and we're going to get into that, comprehensive zoning and other more individualized zoning actions, all have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So that's been a development in the law over the last 20 years, kind of a struggle between the state and localities about how strictly you have to adhere to your comprehensive plan. And right now, the operative standard is it has to be consistent with. Now, we could talk for hours about what does it mean to be consistent with, and you're not going to get any clear answers. It's kind of like that Penn Central test, multi-factored ad hoc, but that's the operable principle. Also, the comprehensive plan has to implement the state's 12 planning visions that are set forth in Land Use Article Section 1201. Things like quality of life and sustainability, public participation, growth areas, community design, environmental protection. Like I said, there's 12 of them. The planning, the comprehensive plan has to implement those. So you've got your abstract plan in place. The next step, slide, is comprehensive zoning. And this is where you actually kind of are mapping out where residential, commercial, industrial uses are going to be allowed to move forward within the jurisdiction in order to accomplish the vision of you have developed for your jurisdiction in the comprehensive plan. Now, it is meant to apply uniformly throughout the jurisdiction. So the comprehensive zoning is supposed to cover the whole jurisdiction or a large part of it. And within the particular zones, it's supposed to be uniform. So you have only residences within a residential zone, only industrial uses within an industrial zone. We're going to get to exceptions to that, but that's kind of the principle that underlies comprehensive zoning. Slide. The next step is, once you've got your comprehensive zoning in place, is enactment of zoning ordinances, which take that zoning and start to apply it to individual properties. Essentially, the zoning ordinance sets the ground rules under which individual properties can be developed consistently with local zoning. They regulate things like the density and intensity of development, and they permit land uses either by right. So if you're in a residential area, you can build a residence, or at least you have, assuming you can get a building permit and all that stuff. But residential uses are permissible. In addition to uses by right, there are conditional uses. Now, conditional uses are types of uses that aren't by right, but can be developed under certain conditions. And those conditions are set forth in the zoning ordinance itself. So you've got a legislatively enacted rule or law, if you will, that sets the ground rules for how people can develop property within these different zones, and baked into it are these conditional uses that allow some variation within a zone under certain circumstances. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Slide. Okay, some zoning do's and don'ts. Spot zoning is generally not permitted. Spot zoning is where a small area in a zoning district is placed in a different zoning classification from everything around it. That's not okay if that individual use is inconsistent with the other stuff around it, and if it's done solely for the owner's private interests. Now, what you might be able to do, though, is zone in a residential area one parcel to be used as a grocery store. That's not a residential use, but it's not inconsistent with the uses around it because people need access to groceries. And if it's not done solely for the individual lot owner's interests, it would be permissible. And in that context, it probably isn't done. I mean, the person who owns that lot, yeah, sure, they'll be benefited, but so will the people around them. So that's an example of where you can have permissible spot zoning, but that's a dirty word. You'll see in cases, if someone is doing something that the judge doesn't like, they'll accuse them of spot zoning. So beware of that. Slide. Contract zoning, on the other hand, is always impermissible. And this is an agreement between the zoning authority and property owner on how land is to be zoned. So zoning has to be a public legislative process where everyone can see what's going on. Contract zoning, almost by definition, is a backroom deal, and it's impermissible. Next slide. Piecemeal zoning. This is parcel-specific changes in a zoning classification that occur after you've done your comprehensive zoning. Now, you can do this, but only if you satisfy Maryland's change or mistake rule. And what that means is that you have to be able to establish that the current zoning that you're trying to change through this piecemeal zoning was the result of a mistake that you made when initially doing your comprehensive zoning, or that there's been a change, an unexpected change in how the area developed, and that change necessitates a different use for this parcel. This is, I talked earlier about zoning ordinances being a legislative action, it's like passing a law. This too is a legislative action because you're changing your ordinance to allow for this development, but it is based on property-specific considerations. So before you do a piecemeal zoning, you have to have what's called a quasi-judicial, kind of like a court, factual inquiry into that particular parcel and what is the change or mistake that justifies the piecemeal zoning at this afterwards. Yeah, next slide, thanks. Conditional uses, mentioned them earlier. Again, that's the ground rules for developing land differently from the land around it within the zone under certain conditions. This is the same thing as special exception. You'll hear both terms. You'll probably hear special exception more, but they are identical. They're used interchangeably. But special exception, I think, kind of has the wrong connotation. It makes it sound like it is, some special or secret or different thing, and that it's an exception, whereas it's baked into the law itself. And I think conditional uses is a more accurate way of describing it. All right, next slide. Variances. This is another way that you can adjust how the zoning ordinance operates in order to accommodate individual properties. Because remember, Euclidean zoning is all about uniformity. It's fairly rigid in that respect. And so variances are a way to basically help the government avoid a taking, for example. It's a way to accommodate a property owner who has a property that, due to particular site restrictions, they might not be able to develop on. let's slide. I'll give you an example here. So in this example, the pink building on the right is the proposed dwelling. And if you look at the minimum distance separation requirement, the calculated MDS distance, it would have to be a certain distance away from the barn. But if you put the house there, it would go over the side yard setback requirement. So you wouldn't be able to build it. So you'd have the owner of a house or the owner of a lot who can't put a house on it. That's going to tee up a takings claim. So variance allows an adjustment of these types of size, density restrictions in order to accommodate an individual property owning specific circumstances. And in this circumstance, you would just adjust the side yard setback and allow the house to be built in that side yard. Now, there are restrictions on what you can do with variances. Can you go back, Joe? The applicant can't have created the hardship. So in the example I gave, the barn was already there. They bought their lot, wanted to put in their house. They had no role to play in the restrictions that were causing the problem. Again, the variance avoids hardship, but it has to be specific to the unique circumstances of that property. And again, can't confer a special privilege denied to others. That's something that runs through all planning and zoning law. You can't single people out for preferential treatment unless you've got a really good reason for doing so. All right, skip one more. Now, all of what I've been talking about for the last 10, 15 minutes is about ways to adjust zoning to accommodate individual properties. And it is a way of departing from the uniformity principle, which, after all, as I began talking about zoning, that's what it's all about. Euclidean zones are supposed to be uniform and fairly rigid. The Maryland Supreme Court 2 months ago issued its first decision really going into this uniformity principle and talking about its application to a situation in Prince George's County involving an airport. Now, the airport had been in place for like 80 years, and when it was constructed, it was in the middle of, well, let's just say, middle of nowhere. Then development started to fill in around it, and you had situations where planes had crashed into residences and had landed on residential streets and had run into cars. Not a lot, but a dozen times over the last 60 years, a situation that is less than desirable. The airport owner said, well, meanwhile, the airport owner was starting to lose money. They said, well, in order to have a viable business here, either we have to intensify our airport use and increase the risk that you might have these accidents, or we need to develop it as townhomes. Now, the problem is that the airport is within a zone that is zoned for 1 house on 2-acre lots. No townhomes are allowed. So the developer comes in and says, talks to a legislator, and arranges to get a text amendment to the Prince George's County zoning ordinance to allow for the development of the property in townhomes. And the way the ordinance is set up is this, it's for lawyers at least, it's kind of comical. They wanted the restriction to apply, or the permission to apply only to this airport. But if you write that in your code, this airport may develop as a townhome, that's surely going to be struck down by Maryland's uniformity principle, which bars jurisdictions from singling out individual properties for the property owner's benefit. So they didn't name the airport. They instead had a series of criteria, 5 or 4 criteria that would govern which properties could take advantage of this text amendment. And it was crystal clear that those criteria were designed to apply only to this one property. One of them was you had to be within 1,000 feet of a power transmission line. One of them was you had to be between 100 and 150 acres in size or be formally used as an airport. But that's or, so they're not identifying just the airport. And various other restrictions. As the case was tried, it was very clear that this was designed to only apply to this one property. Well, that sounds like it's going to be a violation of the uniformity principle. The Maryland Supreme Court disagreed, said that it was okay in a deeply divided 4-3 decision. The majority concluded that the measure was facially neutral. It doesn't identify the property, doesn't say, you know, it's not even restricted to airports because of the or word. And it doesn't distinguish, it doesn't discriminate against similarly situated properties because there are no similarly situated properties. There's no other airports, there's no other properties that fit these criteria. So the court said under the test that they apply for determining violations of the uniformity principle, this passed. And that test looked at whether the jurisdiction had a rational basis for the text amendment and whether it discriminates against similarly situated properties. Again, no discrimination because there are no similarly situated properties. And rational basis, sure, there's a rational basis for avoiding planes crashing into people's residences. And there's a rational basis for wanting to get rid of non-conforming uses, which this airport was. The dissent said, oh, well, for Pete's sake, I mean, if the uniformity principle means anything, it means you can't single out properties, and it's undisputed here that this was designed to apply to one property. And the dissent says that all these criteria that are neutral on their face are purely pretextual. It was as if they had written the name of the airport in the ordinance. And so that type of singling out is exactly what the uniformity principle prohibits, according to the dissent. Now, in my view, the real dispute between the two of them, because they largely agreed about the legal tests that apply, was that the majority saw this as making the situation better. It was decreasing the non-uniformity in the zone by taking an airport and turning it into townhomes, which are closer to single-family residences than an airport. The dissent said, no, you're going about that the wrong way. You have to compare the before and after to the law. And the law limits this to one house on 2 acres, and you're allowing townhomes. So you're going away from uniformity. You're making the area less uniform. And that's how it's kind of a glass half full issue. And that's kind of what I see as being the main distinction between the two, because they, again, agreed on the law. And the dissent's real criticism here was, you can do this, but you do it in different ways. You do it through a special area plan, or you do it through piecemeal zoning and satisfy the change in mistake rule through procedures that are more open and require quasi-judicial proceedings. Again, when we were talking about piecemeal zoning, that get out all the facts instead of a developer sitting down with a legislator and trying to get a deal done through the legislative body. So I recommend the decision to you. It is very interesting. It's very well written. It is very long, like 150 pages. So, but if you've got like 3 or 4 hours to burn, I recommend it to you. Next slide. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about vesting. Vesting occurs in Maryland when a property owner has gotten a permit under applicable law to, like a building permit, and has made some physical changes in the property based on that permit, which effectively puts the public on notice that, yeah, they're working on a going concern. And the purpose of that, the importance of vesting. Well, before I get to that, Maryland is what's called a late vesting state, because you need to have both a permit and have begun work. In early vesting states, just a permit will suffice. You don't actually have to have any work done. And even in some states, you don't even need a permit. Maybe a preliminary site plan approval would be sufficient. But Maryland requires both the permit and initiating work. Now, the importance of vesting, slide, is that once a landowner's rights in a particular development vest, they are permitted to move forward with it, even if the law changes in the meantime to prevent that project going forward. And you see that happen. You know, someone gets permission to put in a rubble fill, they start in on it, and then the law changes and says, well, we can't have any rubble fills. If their rights have vested, that's important for the developer, because it means that if you're going to prevent them from developing at that point, they're going to have a good takings claim. And they're going to have a particularly good takings claim because under Maryland law, vested rights have special extra protection. Generally speaking, Maryland takings law defers to the Supreme Court. They're, you know, plug it straight in. But when we're talking about vested rights, the Maryland Supreme Court has said Maryland constitutional provisions lock in additional protections for vested rights, so they're not obligated to follow Supreme Court precedent. So if you can establish that the government has taken your vested rights, you're in a really, really good spot in terms of a takings claim. Next slide. Okay, questions and questions before we move on to start talking
quick
about
before questions. I just want to point out that there are some snacks over there. If somebody wants to grab some, we're not going to stop for a break because we're running a little bit behind. But just so you know, you can go over there and grab it. Come on back.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, in our neighborhood, there's a lot of bars in our neighborhood. A lot of them, like within a 4 or 5 block radius. You know, you got a bar in almost every block. What can be done to address, you know, our community from being inundated with all these bars? How do they treat bars when it comes to the laws that you were talking about?
Bars are treated like any other business when we're talking about takings, for example. So if you were to, I mean, I can't give you specific legal advice. You get, but you know, some things you can do. You can rezone an area to say that there can't be any bars there, but you'd probably have to grandfather the existing ones in and say that when they change ownership, they have to be converted to a different use. That might be an approach, but bars are not accorded any less constitutional protection. A lot of property rights cases, and a lot of free speech cases arrive out of adult entertainment clubs. I mean, you know, they are big champions of constitutional rights because local jurisdictions are trying to zone them out all the time.
I'm sorry. The city at one time was supposed to put them in a certain business district, all the bars, but it seemed like it never went any further than that.
Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a practicing zoning person for 30 some years. One of the things I found interesting is as that reference, the adult use is a First Amendment perspective. Alcohol is not given the same deference that First Amendment rights are. So local zoning can restrict alcohol sales based upon the community standards along the way. So you see dry communities along the way. So there are provisions that you could exclude alcohol sales from your community or restrict them in some manner. Again, they're not given the same deference that First Amendment right aspects are. So again, but you typically in your zoning process, you look at what are called the unintended consequences or the impacts of a certain use. And then you try to factor that into the design of your zoning ordinance to appropriately place those, if you choose to keep those uses along the way. So there's a distinction between, again, adult uses that are First Amendment protections and those that are considered adult uses such as alcohol sales that don't have the same level of protection from that perspective that you could incorporate in your zoning ordinance. But again, it's a local decision on how to handle those issues. Thank you.
Any questions from the internet?
Yeah, one question is up to the municipality to determine the rules of vesting.
No. I mean, there are generally applicable principles that govern when a property owner's rights vest, and a municipality, can't alter those to make the vesting rules, inapplicable or change them radically. There might be ways that they can, the way they define local zoning and what have you, and set up the building permit process, about what types of permits would qualify for purposes of vesting, but those general principles that you need a site-specific building a permit and beginning work on it are Maryland constitutional principle.
Yeah, just real quick, following, you're absolutely, again, never argue with a lawyer. But there are jurisdictions that could grant through their development review process, a broader interpretations of that along the way. And that has happened but it needs to be really clearly articulated in your zoning or development regulations on whether or not you're enabling development to occur prior to that building permit physical improvement. So there are certain instances where local governments articulate those enhanced development rights along the way. It may not be to the level of, they could always change the law. And we'll be talking about later on about ways by which there could be what's called a development rights agreement, where there are abilities for local governments to essentially strike deals and say, we're not going to change the rules later on if you do certain things as a public benefit as part of this development. So there are those distinctions along the way. And I think we do have one more question from the virtual audience.
Yeah, this is one question. It's legislative in nature, but are there any plans to change vacancy laws in Maryland? Maryland gives a lot of rights to property owners, even when they are bad actors. Baltimore City has a huge land banking issue, not to mention derelict property owners. Is there any desires at the state level to propose vacancy tax comparable to DC or Seattle?
I have no idea.
Yeah, that would be a legislative
I don't know if you guys seen
discussion.
legislation along those lines being proposed. I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen anything proposed specifically to a vacancy tax. We do review a lot of legislation each year, so I may have missed it. A lot of bills come up each year that don't go anywhere, but I'm not familiar with that specific one.
Right. And just one, I won't say we're the last people to know at the staff level of these types of things, but legislators hear the community, and your legislators often will try to address those concerns. And there are jurisdictions in other states that have pursued different techniques to promote revitalization of derelict or blighted communities. So there are those examples out there. Whether or not Maryland is pursuing those, I really can't say. I'm not aware of them. But thank you.
Okay. Well, we got to get the.
We are running a little behind, so we're gonna try to keep the responses real quick.
Yeah, with regard to variances, you mentioned the second one, the applicant cannot create the hardship. Can you give us a classic example of that? Thank you.
Chuck, do you have one at your fingertips?
Yeah, I do actually. One that property owners I worked as a planning director for Frederick City for a while, and one developer was notoriously didn't care about the setback requirements and had built something and then gone and asked for forgiveness. And we ultimately brought forth one case where they said, well, hey, because they were literally at the stage of doing the certificate of occupancy. And at that particular time, the house had already been built. They violated the front setback requirement when they put the footers in place and chose not to do the proper surveying up front. And in that instance, it went to the board, and they'd already gotten, and I don't know if they ever did the appeal, they had ultimately gotten to the Board of Appeals, and the Board of Appeals said, all you had to have done is gotten a survey, and if you pushed it back 2 feet, you wouldn't need a variance. Guess what? We're not giving you created this problem yourself. You knew that you could have done a survey process to do this. We're not giving you that. And ultimately, they had to demolish that building and push it back because they didn't, and I'll guarantee you that developer never did it again. That's a self-created hardship. They didn't have to get a variance, and they chose to ignore the law, put the building in violation of setback, and then try to ask for forgiveness later on, and they didn't win.
To move on, or okay, you hit the. We're going to move over now to start talking about boards of appeal under Maryland law. They are required for non-charter commissioner counties and for municipalities. They're authorized in charter and code counties, but all charter and code counties have one. Slide. They have at least 3 members, 3-year terms, appointed by the local executive and confirmed by the local legislative body. That's in non-charter or non-home rule counties and municipalities. Again, for charter and code counties, it's as established by local law. Here's an example of the different forms of governance. Commissioner counties have the rules about Board of Appeals are set forth in state statute. Charter and code home rule counties, they establish it by law. Slide. Board of Appeals hears and decides appeals when there's been an error alleged on administrative enforcement or application of a particular land use law to a particular piece of property. Conditional uses and special exceptions. Again, remember I talked about how a conditional use special exception is a property specific thing that requires a property specific inquiry. It results in a legislative act, but you need a mechanism for getting at that property specific inquiry. That's more like a trial type court-like proceeding, and the Board of Appeals does that instead of the legislature. Applications for variances, much the same way. It's property specific, needs development of the facts with respect to that property. It's something that the Board of Appeals would handle. Slide. Now that's what I just described is what happens in commissioner counties. Charter and code home rule counties have greater powers. So they can, by local law, task their boards of appeals with handling other types of cases as well. Zoning map amendments, administrative actions on licenses, permits, an assessment of special benefit taxes. They can review those as well if the county or if the charter or code home rule county gives them the authority to do so. Next slide. In keeping with their role as kind of like a trial, they have to follow certain formal procedural requirements. Their meetings are publicly announced, open to the Open Meetings Act. They have to be recorded. There has to be witness testimony under oath, again, a lot like a witness sitting in a witness box in a courtroom, and comply with a variety of local rules and procedure on how the proceeding unfolds. Slide. In most cases, they have to deliberate and vote in open session, and the record must reflect the vote of each member on any matter voted upon. And the written opinion of the Board of Appeals has to set forth factual findings and legal conclusions. Again, that's more like a court than a legislative body. Legislative bodies don't have to make factual findings. When courts review legislative action, they're free to imagine any set of facts that might justify the legislative action. When you're talking about quasi-judicial and Board of Appeals proceedings, it will be evaluated on the basis of the facts found by the body. Slide. Those factual findings are given deference on appeal, but they have to be made and they form the basis for that appeal. The court is not, however, a reviewing court that's above the Board of Appeals, is not bound by the board's conclusions of law, but they are pretty much bound by the factual findings that the Board of Appeals renders. Appeals of Board of Appeals decisions are on the record. Again, it's based on the findings of the Board of Appeals. Very court-like, very different from the legislative process. Slide. Similarly, fitting into that rubric, more like a court, less like a legislative process, is how ex parte communications rules apply. When you're walking down the street and you run into a legislator that you have maybe you have a bill that you've sent to the legislator, you can talk to the legislator about it as much as you want. There's no restrictions on that. But if you have a matter before a court, you can't talk to the judge about the court in an elevator or on the street. That's an ex parte communication. It's impermissible. Those rules apply to the Board of Appeals. So when there's a matter pending before the board, the party is prohibited from communicating with a member of the board about that matter outside of the formal hearing. You've got a process to talk to the board, but it's got to be within that formal recorded hearing so that everyone can see what is going into the Board of Appeals decision. If a communication occurs, an ex parte communication occurs, the board member should disclose that to the rest of the to all the parties and the other board members and summarize that communication on the record. You don't necessarily have to recuse yourself, but you do have to disclose it to everyone involved. Next slide. Q&A on boards of appeals. Otherwise, we're moving into the ethics rules, which I'm sure is why you're here to begin with. Everyone's very keenly interested in ethics. Okay, slide. The state ethics laws prohibit both, ethical improprieties and the appearances of impropriety. And of course, the purpose of ethics rules is to ensure fair dealings by disinterested public officials who are not subject to backroom inappropriate influence. Next slide. The General Provisions Article, Section 508, sets forth the rules that apply to counties and municipalities. They must enact provisions on conflicts of interest, financial disclosure, and lobbying. And those local ethics rules have to be similar to state ethics rules. They don't have to be identical. Local jurisdictions can adjust those to fit their local circumstances, but they have to be similar. Next slide. So some examples of conflicts of interest that the ethics laws prohibit. You can't hold outside employment that would impair your impartiality or independence of judgment. For example, a forester in the Department of Natural Resources Forest Service could not serve as a member of a local planning commission because the commission had duties relating to site plan approval and forestry management activities. Those were also regulated by DNR. So you'd have one person sitting on two different bodies serving different masters about the same area. That's going to raise questions about the impartiality of the person's judgment. You can't use the prestige of your office for private gain. This often draws some laughter, as if, you know, being a state official really carries a lot of prestige. But what it means is that you can't go to, let's say you've got a friend who's got a building permit application and there's a hearing. You can't go to that hearing and testify in favor of it and say, and I'm a member of the Planning Commission, and I think this is a good idea. Because then you're invoking your prestige of office to benefit someone else. You can't use confidential information acquired in official capacity for the benefit of the other. So if you learn through your Planning Commission role that someone is about to develop a property and it's going to increase the value of the properties around it, you can't tell a friend that so they can go up and buy some of those lots around it and try to capture that increase in value. That is a violation of the ethics laws. Now, the last one is deals with you can't participate in a matter in which you or certain of your relatives have a legal or economic interest. Slide. And what is the actionable legal or economic interest? It's a few different things here spelled out in the law. You can't hold an interest in a business that is negotiating a contract or has a contract with your agency. You can't be employed by a business that is negotiating with or has a contract with the agency. And you can't represent any party for a contingent fee before any local body. So all of these things share one thing. You can't have an economic stake in the entity or the project that is before the Planning Commission. And it applies to you and your, quote, qualifying relatives, which include spouse, parent, child, or sibling. It doesn't matter if you don't like your sister. If she comes up before your Planning Commission, that's going to be enough to raise a conflict of interest. Now, subject to certain, to limited exceptions, you can't solicit or accept gifts of more than nominal value, $20, from anyone who is regulated or does business with your agency. And after you've left government service, you can't represent someone else in connection with a matter that you worked on or that you participated significantly in while with the Planning Commission. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have been the decision maker. Just providing advice and recommendations about a specific matter can be enough, but it also doesn't include things where you're just tangentially involved. So it's meant to, again, prevent you from capitalizing on your knowledge with respect to a specific project, not so much about your expertise that you developed with the Planning Commission. That's okay. Next slide. Now, we talked earlier about in the ex parte communication context, you don't necessarily have to recuse yourself. You just have to disclose the ex parte communication if you're on the Board of Appeals. Recusal, though, is required in certain circumstances. So planning, your spouse appears, has a development project that coming before the Planning Commission. You're going to have to recuse there because you've got a qualifying relative who's bringing a matter before the commission. And if recusal is necessary, you can't participate in any way in this circumstance. Disclosure and then participation doesn't work. You have to recuse yourself entirely. Slide. If you have questions about ethics, you don't ask me. The Attorney General's office doesn't construe the ethics law. You got to go straight to the horse's mouth on that one. The State Ethics Commission, they're very helpful. They field questions all the time. So reach out to them if you find yourself in a conundrum. Any questions, or should we move right on to the test? Oh. Hey, Chuck, should I skip the test? Oh, okay.
So a question about recusal and employment. So if there is a company that has an application in to the Planning Commission, and let's say your spouse works for that company, they're not involved in the project that is being submitted in any way, but they do work for the company in another matter, does that require a recusal?
So it's not in a procurement context, it's just a project. It's not in a procurement context, it's just a project. It's like a development company that has a proposal before you. Yeah, the law specifically prohibits more of that procurement where you're doing business and negotiating a contract. But I'm not certain what the answer to your question is, because again, when I get questions about, state officials come to me with questions about state ethics, I go to the Ethics Commission. There are dozens and dozens of state ethics advisory opinions that go into these details, and I'd want to look into those before I gave you a definitive answer.
The short answer to that is always contact your town attorney or county attorney, and they will advise you along the way.
Any questions on that?
All right, so we're going to move on to the test. First one's about development rights. So development rights do not vest until construction is complete. Slide. No, because Maryland is a late vesting state, but you don't have to complete construction. What about the applicant obtains government approval on a preliminary plan? No, that's the early vesting states I've mentioned. That's not sufficient for Maryland. How about applicant has a building permit and has made visible changes to the property, thereby giving notice to the public? Yes, that should sound familiar. Next one, public notice is printed in a local newspaper. Slide, no. Public notice kind of snakes through why we have vesting rules, but there's no requirement that it be published in a newspaper. Next slide. Okay, regulatory taking occurs when your lawyer says so. That's not a bad answer, actually. When you're in the Penn Central test world, when you're not one of these categorical takings situations, it is really difficult. And it is a kind of a, I know it when I see it, kind of a feeling. But no, the law prohibits me from saying that that's the right answer. Next one, yeah, a use is not permitted under current rules. No, that can give rise to a taking if it's the only use that you would otherwise be allowed to be able to put your property to, but it's not enough. Regulation removes all economic value in a property. Yes, that's the Lucas total take circumstance. When it is determined that a variance is needed, no, a variance is a way to avoid a taking, but just because a variance is needed doesn't necessarily mean that the property owner will have a taking if they're not granted the variance. Okay, next slide. An unconstitutional exaction occurs when the exaction has nothing to do with the governmental purpose of the exaction. Yes, because remember, rational nexus and rough proportionality, the government has to establish both of them to survive a challenge. So if it doesn't, it has nothing to do with the governmental purpose, that's an unconstitutional exaction. The impact of the exaction far exceeds the governmental purpose for the exaction. That too, that's the rough proportionality test. There is both a rational nexus and rough proportionality between the exaction and the governmental purpose for the exaction. That's the only time it's not an unconstitutional exaction. All right, next slide. A hearing before a Board of Appeals must be recorded. Yep. Be held in the evening? No, they often are, but they're not required to be. Have testimony taken under oath? Yep. That's one of the trial type proceedings that boards of appeals must follow. Include the recorded vote or failure to vote of each member. Yes, that was, again, one of the procedures that apply. Next slide. Counties and municipalities must enact public official ethics rules for the following. This is, remember Joe's earlier advice about all of above. Lobbying, financial disclosure, conflicts of interest, all of the above. Next slide. Ex parte communications from a party to a board member, A, should be encouraged to gain additional information for decision-making. No. Always require recusal of the Board of Appeals member. No, not necessarily. Must be disclosed to all parties and summarized on the record. Yes, that is required in all the circumstances. Should be kept confidential under one or more executive privileges. No. Privileges sometimes do apply to communications among Board of Appeals members, but not to an ex parte communication between a board's member and someone else. And that's it. Well, no, that was the questions already. We're moving on. All right, ceiling with you.
Okay, so we're a little behind. This class is always trying to fit like at least 3.5 or 4 hours of content into a 3-hour period. So this happens every time, but I think we're doing better than we often are. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. I think a lot of you probably have experience with comprehensive plans. If you would like some more information about it, please see me. The MPCA has done a comprehensive plan specific training in a number of jurisdictions, and that's always available if you really want to get a deeper dive. Okay, so what does a comprehensive plan do? All right, we're talking about the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. And Adam talked about the police power. Focus on resource conservation, make sure your built environment is well designed, interconnected, and the facilities can support it. Predictability and transparency is very important. People should be able to read a comprehensive plan and know where their community is going. These could be homeowners, residents, or even employers, or even developers. And as always, public participation is vital. Next. Okay, so the Planning Commission has a major responsibility in developing a comprehensive plan, as outlined in the land use article. And they have to prepare and present that comprehensive plan to the local legislative body, council, commission, whatever it is. Often, you know, they do that in partnership with staff, potentially a vendor, and the public. Next. So Maryland has 12 planning visions that are embodied in the state government article and the land use article, and the requirement of comprehensive plans is to advance these visions. It started off with 7 and over the years has grown to 12. If you go to the land use article, you'll see further descriptions of what they are. But you can think of these as key components, topics that a comprehensive plan must address. Next. Okay, so the comprehensive plan should start with and always have that vision for the community's future. How is it? But you also want to look backwards as well, right? You often see this in something called an existing conditions report or analysis. How has your community evolved? What's the history? How's it grown? In some situations, how's it not grown? What are the trends, employment, demographics, the like? Should also have goals, objectives, and policies to realize that vision. Think of goals as where you want to get to. Objectives are like how you measure if you are getting there. And then what are policies? What are some decision points? What are some strategies or actions that you can take to get there? All right, so those are key components of all comprehensive plans. Next. Okay, so that, the comprehensive plans, they guide growth. It's kind of a rule book, not a rule book, but a game plan that you can follow. Inventory, it could be, again, demographics, but also public facilities. It analyzes maybe even previous plans. How effective were we with the previous plan? What worked, what didn't? What do we need to change? What are our recommendations? How are we going to implement it? This is very, very important. Oftentimes, many people criticize comprehensive plans, and often fairly, for just being something that is done because you have to do it, and then it just sits there and doesn't get implemented. People don't look at it again. So you really need to focus on implementation. Who's responsible for implementing certain components? How are we going to have funding for this? You know, when are these decisions going to be, these decision points going to be applied? And they need to have feedback and adaptive management. Like how, you know, you shouldn't just have the comprehensive plan and not visit again, obviously, but also, you know, you should not just wait 10 years to look at it again. Where, you know, what has been working after 2 years, after 3 years? How can you adjust it? You know, you can always amend your comprehensive plan. There's also a 5-year implementation report that's due 5 years after the comp plan is adopted. Next, please. All right, there are certain required elements of comprehensive plans, and this changes based on charter or non-charter counties. So these are some basic ones. You need to have goals, policies, vision, transportation element, focuses on transportation, travelways. You think of elements as they're often chapters in a comprehensive plan. So you have a chapter on your water resources. If you're a municipality, you have a chapter on municipal growth and sensitive areas. Some are optional or they're required if something exists. So like if you have current geologic information, you need to have a mineral resources element. Or if you are on tidal waters, you need a fisheries element. Or if you're a municipality, you have municipal growth element. Charter counties, non-charter counties don't have to have that. These don't have to be chapters, they can just be components. And then the land use article will outline what each individual element has to have, but even those outlines in the land use article are pretty high level. So you have some leeway within them. Next. Some other ones are land use, community facilities. I mentioned fisheries already. And then the newest one is the housing element. This was previously a permitted or optional element. Now, as of June 1st, 2020, it is required in all comprehensive plans to have a housing element. All right, next. Optional elements are ones that are permitted, are some included here as well. So you are required to have certain elements, but you shouldn't feel restricted to only have those elements. You can go next. Okay, so the comprehensive planning process is not easy. If any of you have been through it, definitely understand that. There are often different viewpoints, right? How do you balance the desire to conserve land with the desire for property rights, right? And you have to consider the public interest long term. But the only way, what also will make it more difficult is engaging the public, engaging all stakeholders, property owners, employers, nonprofits, potential developers. You can hire consultants, create advisory groups, all these different strategies. It might make it longer, more complicated, harder to hear from all these different voices, but in the end, it's going to make a more implementable, more acceptable plan. But you're never going to please everybody. That's just the way it is. Next. I think I've mentioned enough times how important public participation is, but here's just some examples of what I mentioned, that throughout the process that they should be involved. You can do surveys, you can do public meetings in different parts of your community. You have work sessions, public hearings, and you should also, what I like to call in-reach. There's outreach to members of the community, but in-reach I think is just as important. So the planning department just doesn't sit there by itself and create the plan, right? You should have your transportation, your public utilities, all your different agencies within a local government, because the comprehensive plan is going to impact them all and they're going to have input for all of them. So I think in-reach is just as important as outreach. All right, work sessions are very important. These are often, they're usually done the public is invited, but not open for public comment. What you see here on the right is a SWOT analysis. As many of you might be familiar with that, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a good way to, perhaps start the process, or maybe after you've gotten a little bit of analysis done, what are we doing well? What are our concerns? What do we need to work on? You probably want to do, if you've done any background studies, it could be, transportation study, it could be analysis of your water and sewer systems, could be a study on housing affordability in your community. These are all important to include in this process, discussed during a work session. This is really where the Planning Commission with staff perhaps a consultant that was hired can really dig into these issues. You could focus on one issue at a time. I know a lot of communities will do one element at a time. And while there isn't public input often at the work session, there are all these other opportunities for public input that could be discussed by the Planning Commission during the work session. And then you also have different drafts of the plan along the way. Okay. It's important to note that comprehensive plans need to coordinate with a lot of other plans. In my division and the Maryland Department of Planning, we're often looking for consistency with the comp plan. Right, so municipal growth, when it comes to annexations, if you're a municipality and you want to annex, that area you want to annex needs to be consistent with your municipal growth element. So you should be able to go to the municipal growth element, read it, and understand, okay, they want the municipality, when ready, wants to annex this property. That it should be explained in the comprehensive plan. School planning, particularly for counties, all right, increased capacity, where you might want to put schools, where, you know, the location of them, that should be described in the comprehensive plan. We strongly suggest we're always talking about Maryland Department of Planning, local education agencies and planning agencies work together, because schools can drive growth, and we know how, you know, tough school planning can be and controversial it can be. So let's talk about it early in the comprehensive planning process. Water resource planning, we review water and sewer plan amendments and plans at the county level for consistency with the comp plan. You know, your comp plan should describe those portions of your community that you want to serve with public water and sewer, because that's another key driver of growth. If you extend sewer to a property, it's much more likely to be developed, marketable, but that should be addressed in the comprehensive plan. That should be consistent. Transportation, yeah, you're good. Interjurisdictional coordination, this is also very important as part of your outreach engagement process. If you're a municipality, include your county, all right? Especially on that municipal growth component. If you are a county, include other counties. If you're a municipality, include other local major municipalities, because transportation, waterways, housing, so many of the things that planners plan for don't just stop at the municipal or county border. We are a larger community. People deciding where to live and invest don't often see those boundaries themselves, so we need to plan together. All right, reviewing the draft comprehensive plan. So the draft is created by the Planning Commission, and there must be a comment review period. There's certain notification requirements, and then when you're ready, when the Planning Commission has a draft that they've been working on for a year or however long, many years, right? They send it to the Maryland Department of Planning. At least if you're a non-charter county or municipality, that's us. We have 60 days to review it, provide comments. We send it to our sister agencies. They provide comments. And then that document that we send back to you, that's made part of the public record for that public hearing. You need to hold one public hearing prior to recommending to your legislative body approval of that comprehensive plan. But then it is the council or other legislative body that actually adopts it, and they're also required to have a public hearing. They can modify it. They can send it back to the Planning Commission to continue working on it. But there are these certain requirements of the process. And then every 10 years, a jurisdiction is required to at least review their comprehensive plan for applicability, right? You don't have to update it every 10 years. Oftentimes they are updated every 10 years, usually to align with the release of new decennial census data that shows, remember we were talking earlier about that analysis, what are our trends, that new data can help you, but you're not actually required to update it. But you do need to review it every 10 years. Next. All right. There's all sorts of comprehensive plan assistance out there. Maryland Department of Planning has created also many what we call models and guidelines to help with different elements. We have regional planners. We have 6 different regions in the state. I hope you know your regional planner. If you don't, I'm happy to tell you. Some of our regions have multiple regional planners. Some have one, but they can be on stakeholder advisory groups. They can provide feedback on draft documents. We encourage you to reach out to us and other state agency early in the process, as opposed to just waiting to the end with the 60-day review, because we might be able to help you with something early. It's easier to make changes or adjustments earlier in the process than way at the end. All right, so definitely reach out to us. And then we have on-demand documents that can definitely help you. Our newest one is our housing element models and guidelines to help with that housing element, which is the newest requirement. Go ahead. Any questions about comprehensive plans? Can we pass out the microphone?
No virtual questions. Yes.
Did you turn it on? Okay. Yeah.
Do you have the current plan, a master plan is the Santel Holland Park plan, master plan? Do you have what's currently going to be put in place? Because a lot of us in our community are at a loss
Mhm.
at what's the update on it, who's the contact person?
Yeah.
And also, can I get a map of the area that, I live in and, represent the people to, help understand what's going
Yeah.
on and where it's going?
We have on our, I can answer this question to a certain point. We have all adopted comprehensive plans on our website. Now, if you're talking about an area plan for your community, we don't have all of those. And it can get complicated in a lot of larger jurisdictions like Baltimore because some of these, they'll have these sub-area plans that were adopted a long time ago. They're incorporated into comprehensive plans. And we'd have to do a little digging about Sandtown. But I know Baltimore is currently updating their comprehensive plan through a process called Our Baltimore. So I would encourage you to look at that. I'm not exactly sure where they are in the process right now. But we always find that for you. But more likely, Baltimore City is going to have your specific area plan.
Just to clarify, we have all the plans that local governments provide us.
Send us. That's a good point.
So sometimes, first of all, the municipalities and non-charters are required to submit them to us. Not charter counties are not required.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so we get a draft and we try to monitor, but I can't guarantee you that when it's adopted, they might keep it a secret from the state for whatever reason, and they don't come back to us and say, here's our adopted one. We certainly try to find out, but when we get them adopted, we are posting them, and we need to do some updates. Actually, we want to actually include historical map plans as well. But that's not the long.
We also post drafts in all of our comments. So I was talking about the 60-day review comments. We also post those on our website. We can talk a little bit more later. Yeah. It's a good question. We do our best to keep up with it. There's a lot of plans. Yep. Sure. Absolutely. Yes.
So we're in Baltimore County, and the planning board just got done with the 2030 master plan, which we passed to the council. We had an incredible amount of opposition from developers to digitalizing the plan and having live links in the plan. What is the trend among other counties for digitalizing the plan? Right now, they're asking for it at the council level. Now they're asking for a PDF version of the plan. So I'm just wondering what the trend is among other counties.
You might need to give me a little more about what you mean by digitalizing, but I'd say the trend is definitely all drafts and definitely all all digitally available. Now, internally, how digitalized they are, that'll vary with capacity. Some jurisdictions, like a lot of map.
Yeah.
I'd say it again depends on capacity. Smaller municipalities are going to have a less interactive one, but a county, a larger county, is going to they tend to be more interactive and digitalized.
So there's a couple of things you've raised there. One is a maintenance aspect of the plan that you put in place. So if you put links in your plan and they're two departments or whatever, if things change, those links break. So there is a downside to getting it too interactive. The other so I think it's good, and we want to encourage them, but there's a balance, and like each local government's going to make that decision. The second thing is, once adopted, that document is kind of frozen in time until it's amended. So you have to be cautious about having links to references that are implied policies that could be changed and were not intended to be changed by the plan itself. So again, this is why, again, talk to your attorneys. What is the aspect, what is, where is the situation of this document has been adopted. It essentially is a static document, and while we want it to be as interactive and as up to date as possible, there's just a caution, I say, in terms of what the interactive link goes to and what is it implied. Is it really a policy or is it illustrative? If it's illustrative, not a big deal. But if it's implying the policy is our policies are in this particular area, and even if you reference the state law or the state portion, that could change. Or if the greenhouse gas plan, that changes. So you have to be mindful of, was that the intent of your local government at the time of the adoption when you have those links? So that just a cautionary thing.
One more question, and then I got to keep going.
Okay.
Right here, sorry.
One concern I have as a planner is that the pace of change that affects all of us, significant change, it seems to be accelerating.
Mhm.
Almost every comprehensive plan out there today is older than 5 years old.
Yes.
And I know we've been confronted with just a host of issues that were never contemplated in the comprehensive plan that we are relying on now for guidance in terms of changes to the land use ordinance and other important issues. Have you given any consideration at the state level to mandating more frequent updates of the comprehensive plan?
I would say it used to be 6 years prior to my even time with the department. And I see your position. It's a very political issue. And some would say, has the state considered making it every 20 years, right? Now, we would always encourage amendments as often as you deem appropriate. It was changed from 6 to 10 years to align with the release of decennial census. I wasn't involved in those discussions. But this idea of mandating it to be more frequent would be very political. And I can't say the state is thinking about that, but there may be other people that are involved in planning at the state level outside of state government that are. But yeah, there'd be a lot of people that disagree with you is what I would say. So
Just a quick follow-up on that. The issue of, and when they change the legislation, it does take a long time from the time you adopt a plan to where you implement it. And the challenge is, have you really evaluated that implementation before you update it? So again, each jurisdiction is different. Some jurisdictions are very slow growing or no growing or going backwards in growth. They don't have the same land use issues that is a fast growing community.
Sure.
There are different strategies in the planning realm on how to deal with this issue. You could have a comp plan that is very policy oriented, and then having more sub-plan areas that you update more regular. Any planning requires staffing, and so that's the challenge of your community, is being able to staff and maintain whatever you put in place. So again, each jurisdiction is a little bit different along the way. We're going to get moving on.
yeah, so we're a little behind, but thank you. Again, my division particularly works a lot on planning or comprehensive plans, so we're happy to follow up with you some more detail. All right, so let's zoom through the planning commission roles and responsibilities because we need to get to the growth management tools. So yeah, planning commissioners work with all these different groups. We've touched on most of them at some point today. You can keep going. So yeah, your roles and responsibilities can be formal or informal. Definitely, we recommend looking at your own local ordinances, your own local charters, bylaws, to find out what your role specifically may be. We've already talked in depth about the comprehensive plan. Any other recommendations, such as ordinances to follow up on implementing that plan or regulations, you're providing an advisory role and sometimes an approval role to the legislative body. Can keep going, Chuck. All right. We've already talked about this. Keep going. I feel like that slide got snuck in there. Oh, I don't know what you're doing there. It's all right. I think you still have that on the screen. Can you close that? Okay, yeah, planning commissions have different role depending on if they're charter counties or non-charter counties. So in non-charter counties and municipalities, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes they're described similarly of the same requirements in the land use article. You can have an advisory role in zoning ordinance changes to the subdivision or development regulations. Some development approvals like PUDs or planned unit developments can have a role in capital budgeting and programming. And other things such as land preservation tools, annexations, and development rights and responsibilities agreements, which Chuck will talk about. Keep going. All right. Actually, go back one. I think we jumped one ahead. My apologies. All right. So there's some areas in which planning commissions may have approval authority. Or which they do have approval authorities. These include the use of public land for streets, parks, other public purposes. You sometimes have the authority to review and approve some types of developments, minor subdivisions. They can be delegated by non-charter counties and municipalities to the planning commission to make sure you check your own local rules. Talk to your planning department, planning director, or your municipal or county attorney. And this can even be delegated to an administrative process if local laws allow it. Now go to the next one. In some charter counties, and this is not all of them, but planning commissions have approval for rezonings, special exceptions, and variances, which we described earlier, but they can also be given to an administrative hearing officer, while other provisions, such as reviewing and approving the CIP, can be given to a planning advisory board. Again, review your charters. It's going to be different by charter county. Keep going. We talked about work sessions earlier when talking about the comprehensive plan. I know planning commissioners, you know about public meetings, you've been to them, you understand that that's a key part of your role. Work sessions would be delved deeply into an issue, whereas public hearing, you would open it to hear public comment. And these are key aspects. We recommend rules and procedures to develop. They're not required by law. And the MPCA developed a webpage with some examples and guidance on developing rules and procedures and bylaws. But again, they are not required, but they can be helpful. Okay. Hold on. Sorry. All right. Site plans such as the one illustrated here typically show the layout of roads, stormwater facilities, landscaping, and buildings. And in some instances, planning commissions are delegated the authority to approve site plans. It's important for this is a big thing for staff, but also planning commissioners to expect that, if you have meetings coming up where you're going to be reviewing these either from advisory or approval role, that, you're given some notice, some heads up, and you have plenty of time to review that packet. I know this might vary by jurisdiction, but it's also a very important role of the planning commissioner to review what's submitted to them by staff and be ready for that meeting, because, these are it's not only helps the staff move its job along, but people invested a lot in some of these, and it's important to be ready and make sure you have all the information you need to make those decisions. Keep going. All right, then my last slide is the septics law. It's a very complicated law. I'm not going to go completely into. Most jurisdictions have adopted a tier map from the 2012 septics law, and some haven't. But you should, in the development of one, which again, most have within the past 10 years, the planning commission can play a role. But one area where planning commissions do play a role is the reviewing of major subdivisions in tier 3 areas. So there's 4 different tiers. Tier 1 is where those areas served by public sewer. Tier 2 is those areas planned to be served by public sewer. Tier 3 is areas not to be served by public sewer, but you can approve major subdivisions there. And then finally, there's tier 4, which are not to be served by public sewer, and you're not permitted to have major subdivisions there. So if your jurisdiction has not adopted a tier map, you cannot put major subdivisions on septic. But if you have adopted a tier map, the planning commission has a review role in those major subdivisions on septic. It gets complicated, but if you that would be one area that a planning commission has specifically been given authority. So that's it for mine. We can go through these questions. So a comprehensive plan is a reflection of, I think we know the answer. All the above. How many planning visions are there? 12. How many were there originally? 7. Yep. The comprehensive plan process should involve all of the above. All right. I know we should know this one because we talked about this one for a while. True. All right. Any other questions before we get to growth management? I know we are 15 minutes behind. Chuck's going to a lot of detail about zoning, priority funding areas, annexations, and all that good stuff. You want to use that one?
Try this one.
All right.
All right. Hopefully you can hear me and people in the virtual world can hear me and I can go through this quickly enough. So my job is to wrap up in terms of things that you as planning commissioners or board of appeals members, falling all this together from the foundations of planning to the legal stuff to the process and what the planning commission does, et cetera. Now, and in that comp plan, so the next part of it is how do I implement my comprehensive plan? Adam talked about the comprehensive rezoning. So I'm going to really quickly go through what zoning is. As you well know, it's the designation of parts of your community from a use perspective and defining those areas strategically to implement your plan. It talks about bulk issues of how big things should be, how much separations, et cetera, et cetera. It's the most powerful tool in your toolkit for land use regulation perspectives of getting things done and implementing that plan. You often will have a map associated with it. Some maps, depending upon, as Adam talked about, have conditional uses, and there are other things such as overlay zones and other things that can come into play. Next slide. Traditional zoning, as talked about, is that Euclid, which is defining those separated uses in those different areas. More modern aspects of zoning encourage and incorporate mixed use. There are other different techniques out there in addition to zone mixed use. There's plan unit developments and those types of things, but they often incorporate a mixed use component. Next slide. Overlay zones are another aspect of your zoning regulations. Typically, they are associated with types of regulatory process or controls that you typically don't change the use. You may limit it a little bit, but as a general rule, you don't typically in an overlay zone change the use. What you do is you change the process. A lot of times historic districts have overlay zones so that the use is still the same as it was in the underlying zoning, but you have an additional process to go through to go to a historic preservation commission, et cetera. There are overlay zones that may be related to certain types of protections, highway noise overlay zones, or airport overlay zones, other things that you just have to be conscious of and protect are related to it. So again, all of these are related to implementing your comprehensive plan. Next slide. One of the newer versions of zoning out there technique is called form-based zoning, where you really regulate the form of the structure and its relationship to the public space, the right-of-way, and you have less concern about what's actually going on inside of the buildings. And this allows for greater flexibility, hopefully encouraging more development, but also addressing the issues that the local, the public is concerned about is the perception of what it looks like from their viewpoint. How does this really impact their visual aspects of their community? Do they want things massive or do they want things smaller? Form-based code allows us to incorporate these performance standards and lessen up on the actual uses within the structures. Next slide. The second most powerful tool that a local government has to implement their comprehensive plan is their subdivision regulations. Subdivision is the division of a parcel into one or more lots. So Adam referenced before zoning regulations where there was a lot merger provision in their code. So you can actually have a subdivision that actually, or there are what they call consolidated subdivision plats, where they consolidate lots from many parcels into one. It's still part of the process of a subdivision. Typically, next slide. Typically in the subdivision regulations, you deal with the public space. Sometimes there's dedication of public right-of-ways. If your comprehensive plan, and I always encourage this in local governments, particularly if they're in a growing area where they're developing farmlands, incorporate into your comprehensive plan future roads, where you want those major roads to go. It does a lot of things by doing that. One, it puts on notice the property owner of where those roads are of a farm. Hey, we need this road to go through your property to connect A to B, different parts of your community. It changes the value of that property. It influences how much they sell that property. The development community also values that being known on the comprehensive plan and incorporated in the subdivision, because then that's a part of the negotiation with the property owner and the farmer or whatever in the sale of it. It also dictates how much it's going to cost them in terms of getting their money back. Again, we're in a capitalistic society here. So if I'm going to develop that piece of property, I don't do it for free. I have to have some kind of means by which to recoup my investment on this property back into that. So they need to know what kind of road this is going to be. Is it going to be a boulevard road, or is it going to be a narrow local road, or what have you? So you want to try to incorporate in your comprehensive plan details about your road network and where you want those public spaces to be. If you can identify future school sites that are going to be on an area, do that so that the developer can factor it into their process, so that you can, quite frankly, negotiate with them. Say, you want a mixed use, you want to have higher densities here? We'd like to get a school site from this thing. And that works out to be mutually beneficial along the way. It saves money for the community as a whole. It gets an asset into an area, and it's properly planned. So the comprehensive plan and subdivision activity really work hand in hand in the implementation of the process. Subdivision regulations incorporate standards for streets, utilities, where they are, how they're accommodated, and landscaping requirements. Do you require on your subdivisions and your public improvements street trees, curb, gutter, and sidewalk? All of those kind of details are needing to be in your specifications for your subdivision regulations, and they ultimately have a platting requirement that you record the document in the courthouse for conveyance. So you can't convey land from one property owner to another unless you do it illegally, until you have a plat that's recorded in the courthouse that says, here's the lots, tax assessor's office assigns tax numbers to everything, et cetera, et cetera. Then you can start transferring ownership of land. Next slide. Third powerful tool in implementing your comprehensive plan is a water and sewer plan. Joe talked about the importance of consistency of the comprehensive plan. Water and sewer plans are mandated to be administered and prepared by the counties. So municipalities need to coordinate their water and sewer planning, if they have the actual facilities, with the county, so that you plan for expansions of the plants as well as the service areas. That should be in the water and sewer plan, so that there's proper timing of when those infrastructures come on board to serve your growth in your communities. Again, local government the county has to do it every 3 years. We see a lot of amendments all the time in fast growing counties. So they do updates 2 times a year, 3 times a year, to just deal with the ongoing update. But they have to do an update and incorporate all of their changes, verify the numbers are still good in their water and sewer plants, in every 3 years. Next slide. So it deals with, again, land development regulations in that process. Phasing issues are all factors into identifying new service areas. Next slide. So again, as part of that water and sewer planning process, it looks at the comp plan, it looks at capacities, zoning capacities, future infill areas. Are you going to be, it looks at uses. Are you encouraging certain type of industrial uses that may use more water than other areas? So it's important for you to factor in and look at the type of utility demands that you're going to be putting into place in that. Next slide. Next bundle of regulatory provisions, we're talking more about planning and infrastructure provisions and those things. This next phase is actually the brakes on or the controls of the pace of growth. Adequate public facilities and ordinances are not, and I will repeat, are not controls in discouraging or precluding development. If you want to reduce your densities or your intensities of growth, change your zoning ordinance. Don't use your APFO to regulate the density standards. You may lose in court. APFOs are intended to match up your pace of growth for your provisions of public facilities. So you plan for that water and sewer, you plan for that road improvement, you're implementing that. You're just growing too fast to get the infrastructure in place. So in that public facilities ordinance, it says, before I approve these new subdivisions or issue these building permits for this new multifamily, is the road ready to handle it? Has the water and sewer plant been upgraded? If not, you could put a hold on it through your APFO rather than, and again, ideally not create moratoriums, but to regulate that flow of development so that you don't get to a moratorium and just throw everything into chaos for an extended period. So APFOs are intended to be more of a break on that, but not, shutting down development until you fix things. Next slide. Yep. Again, any jurisdiction can really adopt them. I noticed, I forgot the numbers, but a lot of municipalities don't do it. A lot of counties do it. Most jurisdictions that adopt APFOs do it for school purposes, and they may do it for roads. Some do it for emergency planning for, types of EMS type of services and those types of things as well. So again, recognizing that it's an important process. We do have a reporting process as part of our requirement. If you drop the APFO, you are to report to the Department of Planning every 2 years on the impact of that APFO on development. Have you had some shutdowns in your community as a result of that? And we report on that. And our requirement as part of our annual reporting to the state legislature is to include your local reporting. Next slide. Any questions to that? No, moving on. I'm going to get us out on time here. I got 5 more minutes. I don't think we have any questions. Keep on. We got one more portion of this thing. Okay. So we talked about the land side of things. So now let's talk about some of the money side of things of implementing it. Money makes the world go round, and you can't develop without having financing in place. So comprehensive plannings have to be, Joe mentioned this before, municipal governments planning, the planning commissions are supposed to approve the capital improvements program annually for your local government, or at least I should say they are supposed to advise the legislative body on that capital improvements process. So capital improvements are getting your infrastructure in place, whether or not it's through some type of impact fees or taxation or whatever. Next slide. So these are the typical sources of funding that are typically put into a comprehensive plan. Obviously, general fund, there's general obligation bonds. Some communities, depending upon their size, they have community development block grant programs that may pay for things. Program open space is a revenue source at the county and pass through to the local governments that help you develop parks along the way. There's state highway funding. There's a few other programs along the way. And as I said, impact fees are another source. Next slide. The capital improvement process is just like the comprehensive planning process. You do an assessment, you figure out what your infrastructure demands are, those needs, you then plan it out and put in place a plan and an implementation process along the way. Next slide. Annexation, in terms of municipality, this is one of your most powerful sources of control for municipalities. You do not have to annex any land. Someone comes knocking to a municipality and say, I want to annex. You could say no. Or you can say, what's in it for me? So the only time that really you could start negotiating, because once you're in the city or in the town, they got to be treated like everyone else. But if they are on the outside and they want in because they want to get your access to your water and sewer service or whatever reason they come to you, bad news is for municipalities, unfortunately, double taxation. There's a reason why development occurs in the county right outside your borders is that they don't have a municipal tax, and if they go to the county. So, and you pay at the municipalities. I can speak personally. I pay the same taxes as the folks in the county, but I also have municipal tax. So municipalities are at a disadvantage in that respect. But you don't have to annex. But if you do annex, you are in a negotiation process in place. Municipal growth element, we talk about, you plan for those identified future growth areas. You also look into what you're going to actually need in terms of infrastructure. Next slide. So requirements for municipality has to be contiguous. You can't, believe it or not, annex something that's already been in another municipality. And 3, you cannot create an enclave completely surrounding it. Maryland's law allows a very flexible enclave definition. As long as you have an umbilical cord out to the county, you can annex a piece of property. And trust me, there's some really unique arrangements like that. Next slide. So you can, through the process of newly annexed, you can say, we'll annex you, but you're not going to do X, Y, or Z. And it essentially is a deed restriction on that property in perpetuity. You can limit density. So that part of that negotiation with the developer or the property owner is powerful in that respect. Next slide. I mentioned this before, development rights and responsibility agreement is the only one of the opportunities where you can essentially have some contract arrangements with the developer. It enables you to say, we're not going to change the rules of the game, and you're relying upon those rules to invest in this property and get this development. So we're going to hold for a certain period of time the zoning regulations and all the other regulations, and they'll be specified in that agreement. And by doing that, you're able to, as a developer, advance your development without fear that things are going to change overnight. Because we're a late vesting state, there's a reason why some developers decide to go that route. Typical, to back up. So it's important to know that under the current law, it says that agreement is good for only 5 years unless it's mutually agreed upon to extend beyond that. I have seen development rights and responsibility agreements are in place for 20 years. I've heard a lot of grumbling about that issue too. So recognizing that it's really only for 5 years under state law unless there's other provisions. Next slide. Again, we talked about there's lots of tools out there. We're available. We have a number of great partners. Mako and MML have great websites, and we're here for resources for you along the way. Next slide. Okay, real quick. Zoning can change through a comprehensive process. Subdivision should show all the above. According to state law, county and water supervision should be kept every 3 years. All the above. What funding sources, and unless amended, extended, development rights are good for 5 years. And which of the following is true about newly annexed land? Must be contiguous, can't be another incorporated jurisdiction, can't create unincorporated or enclaves, all the above. And that's that. Next slide. Okay, you will be getting a frameable photo or PDF from us. We are not, unless you really force us, we're not going to mail you out a piece of paper. We hope that you can find a color printer, because it will be in color and it will have the signatures of our current secretary. I need to update this one, and Joe's signature. You'll be getting a frameable certificate. One more slide. You again will get a notice from us of a PDF for your purposes. Are there any final questions? We want to thank you so much for
There's
being
one-
part of that.
We have one
process.
online
One
question. Regarding annexation, what power do counties have when a municipality wants to annex their land?
Okay, the question is, for municipalities, does basically the county have a say in that process? The short answer is no. The longer answer is they can make your life miserable. And they have challenged they can challenge in court due process questions along the way. And again, they can make your life miserable, and I've seen them do that. You must follow the process of the annexation. And if you don't follow it, it will be a grounds for challenging your annexation. So don't screw up the process.